The envelope was already sealed when Victor Harrow handed it to his man. "Make sure she gets it before 7, he said, straightening his cufflinks without looking up. "I don't want her standing at that door all night in that ridiculous dress." He said it the way a man dismisses a fly. No anger, no hesitation, just the flat, clean certainty of someone who had never once considered that a woman like Cora Whitmore was worth a second thought. Only her 20 acres were. That note would reach her door at 6:53, and it would break something in her that had taken years to build. But Victor Harrow made one mistake that night. He didn't account for the man who lived 3 streets over, the one who noticed things, the one who showed up anyway. If this kind of story moves you, stories about ordinary people who refuse to stay broken, please subscribe to this channel and follow Cora's journey all the way to the end. Hit that like button and drop a comment telling me what city or country you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Now let's go back to Millfield, Texas. 1883. The night everything changed. Cora Whitmore had ironed that dress 3 times. Not because it needed it the 3rd time, she knew that. But her hands needed something to do while her mind kept circling back to the same thought, the one she'd been pushing away for 2 days straight. What if he doesn't come? She pressed the iron down harder than necessary and told herself to stop it. Holt Mercer had asked her, hadn't he? He'd walked right up to her outside the general store on a Tuesday morning, hat in hand, and said, "Miss Whitmore, I'd be honored if you'd let me escort you to the Founders' dance." Clear as that. In front of 3 people, including Ruth Hadley, who could not keep a secret to save her mortal soul. By Wednesday, half of Millfield knew. So Cora had said yes. And she'd gone home and dug the blue dress out of the cedar chest where it had lived, unworn, for 4 years. It had been her mother's. Not a fancy dress. Nothing about their family had ever been fancy. But the fabric was good and the color was something. A particular shade of blue that her father had always said made her look like she belonged somewhere better than a dusty Texas town. She'd taken it in at the waist and let it out at the shoulders, and when she'd tried it on 2 nights ago, standing in front of the small mirror above her washstand, she'd thought, for just a moment, yes. She'd thought, yes, this is what it feels like. Now it was hanging on the back of the bedroom door, and Cora was ironing her petticoat for the 2nd time because she couldn't make herself stop moving. The house was quiet in the way houses get when the person inside them is holding their breath. She'd lived here alone for 3 years. Since her father, Edmund Whitmore, had died of a chest fever the winter of 1880, leaving her the house, the 20 acres, and a handshake agreement with the bank that she'd spent the better part of 2 years honoring down to the last cent. She wasn't complaining. She had learned early that complaining didn't fill a grain sack or patch a fence line. You just worked until the problem got smaller than you were. But quiet could wear a person down. Not the good kind of quiet. Not the kind that settles around you in the evening when the day's work is done and you feel at peace in your own skin. The other kind. The kind that starts to sound like something missing. She'd been careful not to want too much, after the Hadley boys had teased her mercilessly through school for her hand-me-down clothes. After Thomas Greer had danced with her twice at the church social in 1879 and then married Clara Finch 3 months later without so much as a word of explanation. After all of it, she'd learned to keep her wanting small, to hold it close where no one could see it and knock it sideways. But she was 26 years old, and she was tired of keeping things small. She set the iron down on its stand and walked to the window. The sun was going down behind the ridge to the west, painting everything that particular dusty amber color that only Texas evenings had. Down the road, she could see the Founders Hall already lit up, lantern lights spilling warm and gold from the windows. And she could faintly hear, she thought she could hear, maybe she was imagining it, the sound of fiddles tuning up. "He'll be here," she told herself. "He said he'd be here at 7. She turned away from the window and went to put on the dress. It took her longer than it should have to do up the back buttons. Her fingers kept fumbling. She finally got them all and stood in front of the mirror again, and the woman looking back at her was someone she almost didn't recognize. Not beautiful. She wasn't fool enough to call herself beautiful, and she'd never much trusted people who needed to be told they were. But she looked like a woman who was present in her own life, like a woman who had decided to show up. She sat down in the chair by the window to wait. 6:45 came. 6:50. At 6:53, she heard boots on the porch steps. She stood up so fast she nearly knocked the chair over, took a breath, pressed her hands flat against the front of the dress, walked to the door with what she hoped looked like composure. She opened it. It wasn't Holt Mercer. It was Tommy Briggs, the 14-year-old son of the livery owner, red-faced and breathing hard like he'd been running. He was holding an envelope in one hand and his hat in the other, and the look on his face, that particular combination of embarrassment and pity that only a boy who's been sent to deliver bad news can produce, told her everything before she even took the letter. "Miss Whitmore," he said, "Mr. Mercer asked me to bring you this." She took it. Her hand was steady. She would be proud of that later. She closed the door before she opened it. The note was short. 8 lines. Holt Mercer's handwriting, which she recognized from the one letter he'd written her after asking her to the dance. A letter she had read so many times the fold lines were starting to split. "Dear Miss Whitmore, I find myself unable to attend the dance this evening due to a pressing business matter that cannot be delayed. I hope you will understand and not think poorly of me for it. I remain, sincerely, Holt Mercer." That was all. No apology that meant anything. No suggestion of another evening. No acknowledgement whatsoever that she was standing in her dead mother's blue dress waiting for him. She read it twice. Then she folded it back along the same lines and set it on the kitchen table, very carefully, like if she was precise enough about it, the whole thing wouldn't feel so ridiculous. Then she sat down in the kitchen chair and looked at the wall for a while. The fiddle music drifted in through the window. Someone laughed, far away down the road, the kind of big free laugh that belongs to a person having a good time. Cora listened to it and felt something cold settle in her chest. Not grief exactly, more like the particular shame of having let herself believe. She should have known better. That was the thought that kept circling. Not, "He's terrible," or "This is unfair." Just the flat, exhausted voice of the part of her that had been protecting her since she was 12 years old saying, "You should have known better than to let yourself want this." She got up, went to the bedroom, started to reach back to undo the buttons. And then there was a knock at the door. She stopped. It wasn't a tentative knock, not the apologetic sort that Tommy Briggs had made. It was a deliberate knock. 3 times, evenly spaced, the knock of someone who knew what they were doing and why. She stood there with her hand still reaching for the top button of the dress and thought, irrationally, "Holt." She went back to the door. She opened it. Sheriff Elias Vance was standing on her porch. He was not a man who drew attention to himself by being dramatic about it. He was tall and broad through the shoulders, and he carried himself the way men do when they've gotten so used to their own weight that they've stopped thinking about it. He had the kind of face that had been weathered into something that wasn't particularly handsome but was absolutely reliable. Dark eyes that took things in quietly. A jaw that could have been cut from the same limestone as the ridge behind town. He'd been sheriff of Millfield for going on 5 years. Before that, he'd been a deputy marshal down toward San Angelo, though he didn't talk about that. He was holding his hat in both hands, turning it by the brim the way men do when they're about to say something that costs them. He looked at her, really looked at her, the way people rarely did. And something moved through his expression that she couldn't quite name. "Evening, Miss Whitmore," he said. His voice was quiet and even. "I heard Mercer sent a boy instead of coming himself." Cora felt the heat rise in her face. "News travels fast in this town." "Tommy Briggs's father owns the livery," Elias said. "Tommy told his sister. His sister told 3 people at the well." He paused. "I didn't come to embarrass you." "Then why did you come?" He looked at the hat in his hands, then back up at her. "Because the dance is still going on and you're standing here in what I'm willing to bet took some considerable effort to put together, and it seems like a waste of a perfectly good evening." Cora stared at him. "Are you asking me to the dance, Sheriff?" "I'm asking if you'd like to go to the dance," he said. "There's a difference. One of them puts an obligation on you I don't have any right to put there. The other one is just an offer." She had known Elias Vance for 5 years, the same amount of time he'd been sheriff. She'd bought his coffee from the general store where she'd worked 3 mornings a week. She'd passed him on the street. They'd exchanged the usual pleasantries that people exchange in small towns. She had always thought of him as a solid, quiet, slightly remote man who did his job well and didn't involve himself in other people's business more than duty required. She had never once thought of him standing on her porch on a Friday evening holding his hat like it was the most natural thing in the world. "People will talk," she said. People are already talking, he said. Give them something worth talking about. There was something in that, in the absolute lack of performance about it. No charm, no flattery, just a dry, practical observation that made her almost smile despite herself. She looked at him for a long moment. Then she said, "Give me a minute to find my good gloves." She found them in the second drawer of the bedroom dresser, slightly crumpled from being folded too long. She smoothed them out as best she could. She looked in the mirror one more time, and the woman looking back at her still wore the blue dress, still had the same straight dark hair pinned back at the neck. But something in her expression had shifted. Something that wasn't quite hope. She was too careful for hope, but was something in Hope's general neighborhood. She put on the gloves. She went out to meet him. They walked to the Founders Hall without speaking much. The evening air had cooled to something almost pleasant, the way Texas evenings sometimes managed in late spring when the wind came from the right direction. Elias walked beside her at an unhurried pace, and she noticed he'd positioned himself between her and the road, which was such an old-fashioned, automatic sort of courtesy that she didn't think he was even aware he'd done it. "Did he give a reason?" Elias asked, after they'd walked half a block in silence. "Business matter," she said. "That couldn't be delayed." The sound he made wasn't exactly skeptical. It was more like someone filing information away. "You don't believe him," she said. "I didn't say that." "You didn't have to." He glanced at her sideways, just briefly, and then back at the road ahead. "Holt Mercer's been spending a lot of time with Victor Harrow's people these past few weeks. I've noticed it. I don't know what it means yet." Cora frowned slightly. Victor Harrow was the name you heard when people talked about the new money coming into this part of Texas. Land money, development money. He'd bought up 3 properties east of town in the past year, quietly, efficiently, the way a man buys things when he doesn't want you to understand the pattern until it's too late. "What does that have to do with Holt Mercer standing me up?" she asked. "Probably nothing," Elias said. "Like I said, I don't know what it means yet." But his voice had the quality of a man who was already thinking through it, connecting lines she couldn't yet see. And she noticed he hadn't said, "I'm sure it's nothing." He'd said he didn't know yet. There was a precision to that, a refusal to dismiss something just because dismissing it would be more comfortable. She filed that away too. The Founders Hall was full when they arrived. Millfield on a dance night was one of those small-town evenings that remind you what people are actually like when someone gives them music and a reason to wear their better clothes. The Hadley family fiddle trio was in the corner doing something lively that had half the floor moving, women in calico and lawn cotton, men in their good boots. The smell of wood polish and perspiration and the particular sweet, sharp blend of punch that someone made new every year from the same recipe that wasn't written down anywhere. The noise of conversation stopped. Not all at once, which would have been too dramatic, but in the way ripples move across water, one person nudging another, heads turning, the conversation dropping by degrees until the people nearest the door had gone quiet, and the people in the middle were noticing the quiet and then turning to see what caused it. Elias Vance walked into the Founders' dance with Cora Whitmore. Ruth Hadley dropped her punch cup. Cora felt every eye in the room move to her, and she made a decision in the span of one breath. She was not going to look at the floor. She had spent enough of her life looking at the floor. She lifted her chin a half inch, kept her face composed, and walked beside the sheriff to the edge of the dance floor like she'd planned to be here all along. Elias leaned slightly toward her. "You all right?" he asked, low enough that only she could hear. "Ask me in 20 minutes, she said. Something at the corner of his mouth moved, not quite a smile. The suggestion of one. The music started again. The fiddle trio, bless them, read the room and launched back into the reel they'd been playing, and the spell broke, and people started dancing again and talking again, and the eyes that had been fixed on Cora and the sheriff drifted back to their own business. Mostly. Ruth Hadley came over immediately. Ruth was not a bad person. Cora wanted to be clear about that, even in her own head. Ruth was well-meaning and warm and genuinely fond of Cora in the way people are fond of someone they feel slightly superior to. She was also constitutionally incapable of leaving an interesting social development alone. "Cora," she said, with the studied brightness of someone who has rehearsed a casual tone, "I didn't expect to see you tonight." Her eyes cut to Elias and back. "Sheriff?" "Mrs. Hadley," Elias said. Perfectly civil, perfectly flat. I heard that Holt, Ruth started. Couldn't make it, Cora said. Yes, the sheriff was kind enough to offer to escort me. Ruth absorbed this and rearranged her expression into something that was supposed to look like warm understanding, but mostly looked like someone trying to decide which piece of information to share first with which person. Well, she said, that's very kind of him. It is, Cora agreed. There was a pause in which Ruth clearly wanted to say at least 4 more things and couldn't find the opening. Then someone called her name from across the room and she excused herself, and Cora breathed out quietly through her nose. She'll have told 6 people before she gets to whoever called her, Elias said beside her. 7, Cora said. She'll stop at the punch table. He did smile then. Actually smiled. A brief, genuine thing that changed his face considerably, made him look younger and less like a man who'd seen too much of what people did to each other. Cora thought, oh, just that. Just oh. A small, quiet recognition of something she hadn't expected to notice. Then Jim Prater, who was on the town council and had the good social instincts to know when the right move was to act like nothing remarkable had happened, came over and shook Elias's hand and asked him something about the North Road repair, and Cora found herself standing next to Margaret Finch, who was 17 and in love with everyone and thought Cora and the sheriff together was the most romantic thing that had ever happened in Millfield, which she communicated entirely in the form of a wordless, glowing smile. Dance? Elias said, when the conversation with Prater wound down and the fiddle trio shifted into something slower. Cora looked at him. Can you dance? Reasonably well, he said. I won't embarrass you. That wasn't what I was worried about. He extended his hand. She took it. He could dance, not with the practiced showiness of a man who wanted you to know he could dance, but with a kind of steady, attentive competence that she suspected was characteristic of everything he did. He kept the right distance. He paid attention. When she nearly misstepped because she was trying not to look directly at him, he adjusted without comment, without making her feel clumsy. You're overthinking it, he said. I'm not overthinking anything, she said. You are. Your shoulders are up around your ears. She let her shoulders drop deliberately. Better? Better. They moved through the slower pattern of the music. Around them, other couples turned and swayed, and the lamplight shifted, and Cora became slowly aware that she had stopped waiting for the evening to go wrong. It was such an unfamiliar feeling that she didn't know what to do with it. Why did you really come to my door tonight? She asked. They were close enough that she could ask it quietly, and she did. Elias was quiet for a moment. Not the silence of a man stalling, but the silence of a man who was deciding on the honest answer versus the easier one. Because I saw Tommy Briggs running to your house with a sealed envelope, he said, and I already knew Mercer wasn't going to be on that road tonight because I'd seen him 2 hours earlier riding east toward Harrow's property. He paused, and I thought that wasn't right. Cora turned that over. You knew he wasn't coming before the note arrived. I didn't know. I suspected. Did you follow him, Mercer? No, I was making my evening rounds. I saw him on the road. I didn't know what it meant. He met her eyes steadily. But I knew you'd been counting on tonight. How did you know that? He considered this. Because you asked Agnes at the dry goods to hold back a spool of blue thread 2 weeks ago. And Agnes mentioned it while I was in there last week. Said you were working on something for the dance. He paused again. I pay attention to things. It was such an unexpectedly specific piece of evidence, the spool of blue thread, Agnes, 2 weeks ago, that Cora felt something shift in her chest. Not the sentimental kind of shift, something more structural. Like a door in a wall she'd built carefully and maintained faithfully had just developed a crack that had nothing to do with damage. You pay attention to a lot of things, Sheriff, she said. It's the job, he said simply. Is that what this is? The job? He looked at her directly. No, he said. It's not. The music slowed toward its end. They finished the dance, and Elias released her hand, and they stood at the edge of the floor, and Cora thought, there is something happening here that I do not fully understand yet, and that is all right. She did not yet know about Victor Harrow's maps spread across a mahogany desk in a ranch house 8 miles east of town, with her 20 acres marked in red ink. She did not yet know that the man who had stood her up tonight had never been interested in her at all, that his courtship had been assigned to him like a task, a calculated entry point into her trust, her home, the deed to her father's land. She did not yet know any of that. What she knew, standing in the warm noise of the Founders Hall in her mother's blue dress, was that the worst evening she'd imagined had turned into something she hadn't let herself imagine at all, and that Sheriff Elias Vance was watching her with the careful attention of a man who had learned, the hard way, to recognize something worth protecting. Ruth Hadley materialized again from the crowd, this time with purpose. "Cora," she said, with a brightness that had shifted into something more urgent, "I just heard the strangest thing. Mabel Gruder said she saw Holt Mercer's horse tied outside Harrow's place this afternoon. That's the second time this month." She glanced between Cora and Elias. "I thought you should know." Cora felt something cold settle over the warmth of the past hour. "Thank you, Ruth," she said carefully. Elias said nothing, but she saw his jaw set, just slightly, the way a man's jaw sets when a thing he suspected has just moved one step closer to being a thing he knows. And Cora Whitmore, standing in the Founders Hall in Millfield, Texas, in the spring of 1883, began to understand that the note on her kitchen table wasn't just a broken promise. It was the opening move in something that had very little to do with her heart and everything to do with her land. Part 2. A Sheriff with a Hidden Past. Ruth Hadley's words hung in the air between the three of them for just a moment too long. Cora could feel Elias beside her, not moving, not reacting in any visible way that the room could read, but she had spent enough of the evening paying attention to him to notice the small things, the way his weight shifted almost imperceptibly onto his back foot, the way his eyes, without seeming to move at all, had done a quick scan of the room before settling back on Ruth's face. A man cataloging. A man running something through his head quickly and quietly and putting it somewhere he could find it later. "When did Mabel see this?" he asked Ruth. Conversational, just asking. Ruth blinked, slightly surprised to be questioned rather than simply received. "This afternoon, around 3, she said. She was coming back from visiting her sister on the East Road and saw his horse. She knows Holt's horse, that dun mare with the white sock on the left front, tied at the post outside Harrow's main gate." "Did she see Mercer himself?" "She didn't say she did, just the horse." Elias nodded slowly, like he was agreeing with something in his own head. "Thank you, Ruth. I'd appreciate it if you didn't spread that particular piece of information around tonight." Ruth stiffened slightly. The request had been polite, but it had been a request from the sheriff, and Ruth Hadley was, whatever her faults, a woman who understood which side of the law she preferred to stand on. "Of course," she said, and then because she couldn't entirely help herself, "Is everything all right, Sheriff?" "Everything's fine," he said. "Just want to check a few things before people start talking in directions that might not be accurate." It was a masterful answer. It told Ruth absolutely nothing while giving her the sensation that she'd been trusted with something. She drifted back into the crowd with the satisfied expression of a woman who had been included, and Cora watched her go and made a mental note that Elias Vance was considerably more skilled at managing people than his quiet exterior suggested. "You think it means something," Cora said. She kept her voice low. The music had started again, and the room was loud enough that their conversation was their own. "I think Holt Mercer doesn't have any business with Victor Harrow that I know about," Elias said. "And I've made it my business to know most things that happen in a 10-mile radius of this town." He paused. "Your land sits on the eastern edge of that radius." "My land," she said. The two words felt strange in her mouth suddenly, weighted differently than they had this morning. 20 acres, your father's deed. I looked at the county records when Harrow started buying east of town. Yours is one of 4 properties he hasn't approached yet." He looked at her steadily. "But that's what I thought until tonight." The fiddle trio had launched into something fast and celebratory, and around them Millfield was dancing and laughing and being entirely, blissfully unconcerned with what was being said in the quiet margin near the east wall. Cora thought about the note on her kitchen table. The careful handwriting, pressing business matter that cannot be delayed. He was never interested in me, she said. It came out flatter than she intended. Not a question. Elias didn't look away from her. He could have offered her something comfortable, we don't know that yet, or a let's not jump to conclusions. He didn't. I don't know what he feels, he said. I know what he's been doing. It was the honest answer. She recognized it as such, and she appreciated it even though it sat in her chest like a stone. She had known, in some part of herself she hadn't let speak very loudly, that something was off about Holt Mercer's interest. He'd appeared too suddenly, too completely, in the weeks after she'd quietly turned down the preliminary land offer that Harrow's office had sent through a lawyer named Beecham. She hadn't connected those two things until right now, standing here with the sheriff in the noise and warmth of the dance hall, and the connecting of them felt like watching a bruise bloom under the skin. You couldn't stop it. You could only wait for the full color of it to appear. I turned down a land offer, she said, 8 weeks ago, from a man named Beecham acting for Harrow. I sent the letter back unopened with a note saying the land wasn't for sale. Elias was quiet for a moment. You didn't mention that. You didn't know to ask. He accepted that. How long after you sent that letter did Mercer approach you? She thought about it. 3 weeks? Maybe 3.5? Something moved through his expression. Not anger exactly, but a kind of grim confirmation. All right, he said, more to himself than to her. All right, what? All right, I need to think about this carefully before I do anything, he said. Harrow has lawyers and I have suspicion. Those aren't the same thing. What do you need? He looked at her. Really looked, with that quality of attention she was already beginning to recognize as specific to him. The look that wasn't evaluating her, but was actually seeing her. Right now? Nothing. Tonight let's just finish the dance. You came here in that dress and you're going to enjoy at least part of the evening. I don't know that I can just... You can, he said quietly. Because there's nothing you can do about it tonight. And Harrow isn't going anywhere before morning, and you walking out of here early is the first piece of information the room will carry to whoever's watching. She stopped. You think someone in this room is watching. I think Harrow didn't get where he is by not having eyes in the places that matter to him, Elias said. And you matter to him right now, Miss Whitmore. Your 20 acres matter to him. It was a cold thing to say. He knew it was cold. She could see that he knew, that he hadn't said it carelessly. But he'd said it because it was true, and that was, she was learning, the thing about Elias Vance that was most essentially him. He said the true thing, even when the easier thing was available. She lifted her chin. Then get me a glass of that terrible punch, she said, and we'll give them something pleasant to report. The corner of his mouth moved. Yes, ma'am. The rest of the dance, Cora did what she had spent 26 years learning to do. She behaved normally while a significant part of her brain worked on something else entirely. She talked to Margaret Finch about the spring planting. She listened to old Howard Prater complain about the North Road for 10 minutes. She accepted a second dance from Elias when the fiddle trio switched to a waltz, and she noted that he was right. He could dance reasonably well. And she noticed that several people watched them with the particular focused attention of people who were deciding what story to tell about what they were seeing. At 9:30, she told him she was ready to go home. He walked her back. The town was quieter now, the main street mostly empty, the saloon at the far end throwing yellow light and noise into the dark. The stars were extraordinary the way they only got out here, away from the compressed brightness of larger places, spread across the sky in a density that almost seemed excessive. They walked without talking for a while. It wasn't uncomfortable. It was the kind of silence that exists between people who don't need to fill the space between them with noise. Tell me something true, Cora said when they were halfway to her house. About Harrow? About you. He was quiet for long enough that she thought he might not answer. Then, I wasn't always just a town sheriff. I know, Deputy Marshal, San Angelo Way. People know that much, he said. They don't know why I left. She waited. She had learned early that silence was a better invitation than questions. He turned his hat in his hands. The same gesture he'd made on her porch, she noticed, the unconscious fidget of a man saying something that costs him. I was tracking a man named Devereaux, running stolen cattle across the border, and that was bad enough. But he had a way of making trouble disappear. People would go quiet who'd been talking to us. Witnesses. He stopped, started again. We had him. We had him in a position where we could have taken him in, made the case, done it right. And I hesitated. Had my reasons. Thought I needed more. Thought what we had wasn't airtight enough. He paused. Devereaux was gone by morning, crossed into Mexico. One of the men who'd been going to testify against him turned up in a dry creek bed 2 weeks later. The night air moved between them. That wasn't your fault? Cora said. No, he said. It was my hesitation. That's different from fault, but it's not nothing. She thought about that. So you came here? I came here because Millfield needed a sheriff, and I needed a place where the scale of things was something I could actually manage without. He stopped. Without making that kind of mistake again. Have you? Not yet. That's not nothing either, she said. He looked at her sideways, the same brief measuring look she'd noticed at the dance, like he was checking something. No, he said slowly. I suppose it's not. They reached her house. The light she'd left burning in the front window made it look warm from the outside, the way houses sometimes looked better from a distance than from within. She stood on the bottom porch step, and he stood on the ground, and they were almost eye to eye at that height, which felt oddly equalizing. The note's still on my kitchen table, she said. Don't throw it away, he said immediately. Don't throw away anything Mercer's written you. And if you have letters, anything from Beecham's office, anything about the land offer, I kept them. He looked at her with something that might have been surprise. You kept them. My father taught me to keep paperwork, she said. He said a handshake was worth exactly as much as the honesty of the hand you shook. But paper said what it said regardless of what the man who wrote it wished it had said later. Elias looked at her for a moment. Your father was a smart man. He was, she said. The word was landed the way it always did, with a small, dull weight, 3 years and still not entirely absorbed. Keep everything, Elias said. Lock it if you have a box that locks. I'm going to ride out to the East Road tomorrow and look around, and I'll come by in the afternoon if that's all right. It's all right, she said. He put his hat back on, a single practiced motion. Thank you for the dance, Miss Whitmore. Thank you for the knock on the door, Sheriff. He nodded once, then turned and walked back down the road toward town. She watched him go. The deliberate pace, the easy carriage of a man who was already, she suspected, working through what he knew and what he needed to know, and then she went inside. The note from Holt Mercer was still on the kitchen table where she'd left it. She picked it up and read it a third time, and this time she wasn't reading it for hurt. She was reading it for information, pressing business matter that cannot be delayed. She set it down. Got the wooden box her father had kept under the bed, the one with the small iron clasp that locked with a key she wore on a cord around her neck. She put the note inside, put in Beecham's letter, put in the copy of her father's deed, which she'd had made by the county clerk 2 years ago, precisely because she'd learned from her father that one copy of anything important was never enough. She locked it, held the key in her palm for a moment. Then she got undressed, hung the blue dress carefully on its hook, and lay down on the bed in the dark, and thought about a man named Devereaux who had crossed into Mexico while a witness ended up in a dry creek bed, and a man named Elias Vance who had been carrying that specific weight for however many years it had been, and the way he'd said not yet when she'd asked if he'd made that kind of mistake again. She understood carrying something like that. Not the same shape, everyone's weight was their own shape, but the carrying of it, the way it informed every deliberate choice afterward, the way you built your whole subsequent life in reference to the one thing you wished you'd done differently. She thought about Holt Mercer's easy smile and the particular warmth he'd deployed at her like a tool, and she felt the anger of it move through her, clean and cold, which was better than the shame. Shame was about her, anger was about him. She much preferred the anger. She was not going to sell her land. That thought arrived fully formed, as certain as anything she'd felt in years. Not as a decision she was making in this moment, but as a recognition of something that had always been true. Edmund Whitmore had broken his back for that land. had paid the bank down to nothing over 23 years, had planted and cleared and fenced and fixed, and in the end had left it to her because she was the one who'd been there doing it beside him, and there was no force in Millfield or anywhere near it that was going to take it from her by trickery or intimidation or the calculated flattery of a man who had never once looked at her and seen a person. She slept eventually. Not well, but enough. The next morning, she was up before 6 and in the yard when she saw Holt Mercer riding toward her on that dun mare with the white sock on the left front. She stood very still and watched him come. He had the posture of a man who'd spent the night working out what to say, and the slightly too casual expression of a man who hadn't entirely worked it out. He pulled up at the fence line and touched the brim of his hat. "Miss Whitmore," he said, "I owe you an apology." "Yes," she said, "you do." Whatever he'd been expecting, it wasn't that. Most people, when given an easy opening, start filling the silence. Cora didn't. She stood there with her arms loose at her sides and waited, and she watched him recalculate behind his eyes. "I'm truly sorry about last night," he said. "The business matter it wasn't something I could set aside." "What was it?" she asked. "Beg pardon?" "The business matter." "What was it?" He blinked. "It was a land transaction, a time-sensitive negotiation." "With Victor Harrow?" she said. The silence that followed was extremely informative. How did you—" He stopped. Reset. "I do some work for Mr. Harrow, yes. I didn't think it was relevant to mention—" "You didn't think it was relevant," she said slowly, "to mention that you were working for the man who sent a lawyer to my door 8 weeks ago trying to buy my land." His face went through several things in rapid succession. She watched it the way she was watching everything about him now. As data. The surprise was real, she thought. He hadn't known she'd made the connection. That told her something about how much Harrow had told him about her specifically, which told her something about how Harrow operated, which she filed away. "Cora," he said, and the use of her first name now, without the miss, without having earned it, made the anger move through her again, cleaner this time. "I care about you, whatever else you've heard." "I haven't heard anything," she said. "I'm telling you what I know. And what I know is that a man who works for Victor Harrow started courting me 3 weeks after I turned down Victor Harrow's land offer. And last night, instead of escorting me to the dance like he'd promised, that man rode out to Victor Harrow's property." She tilted her head slightly. "What would you make of that?" Holt Mercer opened his mouth, closed it. "Right on, Mr. Mercer," she said. "And tell Mr. Harrow that the land still isn't for sale. Same answer as last time, same answer as next time he asks." "Nobody's asking you to—" "Tell him," she said. There was a long moment in which Cora was aware that she was a woman alone on her property, and this man was larger than her, and employed by someone with money and patience and very few scruples. She held his gaze and did not let herself think about any of that. Holt Mercer turned his horse and rode back the way he'd come. Cora let out a breath so slowly it barely moved. Her hands were shaking, she noticed. Not from fear, or not entirely from fear. From the particular physical cost of holding yourself completely steady when every nerve in your body is firing at once. She went inside and made coffee and sat at the kitchen table and drank it and let her hands shake until they stopped. By noon, the shaking had stopped and she had replanted the kitchen garden section that had been bothering her for a week, repaired the loose board on the east fence that she'd been meaning to get to, and reorganized the contents of the root cellar with a ferocity that left the cellar better organized than it had been in 3 years. She was nailing down the last fence board when she heard a horse on the road, and looked up to see Elias coming from the direction of town. He wasn't in any particular hurry. He rode the way he walked, unhurried, steady, covering ground without appearing to rush. He tied his horse to the post and came to where she was and looked at the fence and at the hammer in her hand and at her expression and said, "What happened?" "Mercer came by this morning," she said. She told him about it, all of it, in the order it happened, without embellishment. She had found, in the hours since, that going over it made her angrier rather than less angry, and she let some of that be visible because she was tired of being tidy about things that didn't deserve tidiness. Elias listened without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. "You told him the land wasn't for sale." I told him to tell Harrow. Same answer as last time. He nodded slowly. Then, he'll go back to Harrow with that, and Harrow will adjust his approach. The courtship route didn't work, so he'll try something else. What else? That depends on how patient he is. Elias looked out toward the east, in the direction of Harrow's property 8 miles away, and his expression was the focused, slightly distant look of a man running through possibilities. Harrow's got a pattern. I've been looking at the other properties he's acquired in the past 2 years. 2 of them, the owners sold under what I'd call unusual pressure. Fencing cut. A barn fire that the fire marshal couldn't officially call arson, but I'd call arson. Small things that built up until the family decided selling was easier than fighting. Cora felt the coffee she'd had that morning sit uneasily. And the others? 1 old man who genuinely needed the money and sold fair. 1 widow who was talked into a contract she didn't fully understand, and by the time she understood it, her lawyer was Beecham. He paused. Harrow's lawyer is her lawyer now. That's not legal, Cora said. It's unethical, Elias said. Legal's harder to prove. Beecham's careful. And Harrow's patient, Cora said, echoing his own words back to him. He looked at her. Yes. She drove the last nail into the fence board with 3 clean strikes, stood up and brushed the dirt off her skirt. What did you find on the east road this morning? He looked slightly surprised. Not that she'd asked, but at the precision of the question, she thought, like he'd expected her to stay with the fear a little longer before moving to the practical. Tracks, he said. 3 horses, maybe 4, out past the Dunbar property. Recent, stopping at the fence line of your eastern border. Cora looked at the eastern fence line of her property, which from where they stood was visible as a thin, dark line against the pale brown of the open ground. They were looking at my land, she said. Or measuring it, he said. The tracks stopped at one point for long enough that whoever it was wasn't just passing. She was quiet for a moment, processing this. The land that her father had fenced post by post, that she'd maintained wire by wire, was being looked at and measured by men employed by someone who'd already decided it was going to be his. The anger she felt at that was clean and fierce, and she noticed entirely free of the complicated tangle of shame and hurt that the Mercer situation had involved. This was simpler. This was her property, and someone was eyeing it the way a man eyes something he's planning to take. I need to understand what he actually wants with it, she said. Not the land specifically. Why my land? Why these 20 acres? He's got property east and south of here already. Why does mine matter specifically? Elias was quiet for a moment. It was the quiet of a man who had information he was deciding how to share. Railroad, he said. The word landed simply and with considerable weight. There have been survey teams through this part of Texas for the past 18 months, he said, looking at routes east to west. There are 2 possible paths they've identified. One goes 3 miles south of town and avoids most of the privately held land in the county. The other goes through here. He looked at her. Directly through your 20 acres, and the Dunbar parcel to your east, and then to the 3 properties Harrow already owns. Cora stood very still. If a railroad comes through this land, she said slowly, the value would be substantially different, yes, Elias said, with the careful understatement of a man who meant unrecognizably. And Harrow knows this already. The surveys, Harrow's been in communication with the railroad's regional office in Fort Worth for at least 8 months, Elias said. I found that out this morning. Talked to a man named Gideon Farr, who used to work for the county assessor's office and moved to Fort Worth last year. He knows things about what moves through the railroad's land acquisition lists. He paused. Your property was on that list 6 months ago. 6 months ago. 3 months before Beecham had come to her door with the quiet, reasonable offer that she'd sent back unopened. 3 months before Holt Mercer had materialized outside the general store with his hat in his hands and his calculated, practiced warmth. The entire sequence of it arranged itself in her mind in one cold, complete picture. He's been planning this for at least half a year, she said. Probably longer. Probably longer, Elias agreed. The afternoon light was shifting toward the west, elongating the shadows across the yard. Somewhere in the distance, a bird she couldn't name was making a sound that seemed inappropriate to the occasion. Cora looked out at her land, the eastern fence line, the fields her father had cleared, the ground that was, it turned out, worth considerably more than anyone had told her, and felt the weight of the situation settle in fully. She had thought she was dealing with a man who had used her feelings to get close to her property. That was bad enough. What she was actually dealing with was a calculated, multi-month operation run by a man with lawyers and money and the kind of patience that only came from being very sure you were going to win. "How many other people know about the railroad route?" she asked. "In Millfield? Maybe 4 or 5 people," Elias said. Harrow made sure the information stayed controlled. It's easier to buy land at current prices if the sellers don't know what it's about to be worth. "He's been buying at current prices," Cora said. "The widow, the families that sold under pressure, none of them knew." "None of them knew," Elias confirmed. She turned to look at him directly. "But I know now." He met her eyes. "You know now." There was something in the exchange, the simple, unadorned transfer of information between two people who had decided to be on the same side of something, that felt more significant than anything that had passed between them at the dance, more significant even than the conversation on the walk home. That had been two people becoming cautiously acquainted. This was different. This was a decision. "I'm not selling," she said. "I want to be clear that knowing what it's worth doesn't change that. If anything, I know," he said. He said it quietly, but with a certainty that suggested he had, in fact, already known. "Then what do we do?" she asked. Elias looked out at the eastern fence line, then back at her. "I keep gathering what I can on Harrow's methods, the cut fences, the barn fire. If I can build a pattern of behavior with enough specifics, I can take it to the federal marshal's office in Austin. Harrow operates across county lines, which makes it federal business." He paused. "That takes time." "How much time?" "More than he's going to be comfortable giving us, probably," Elias said honestly. "He knows now that the courtship approach failed. He's going to move to his next strategy, and depending on what that is, we may need to move faster than I'd like. So, in the meantime, you keep documentation of everything, anyone who comes to the property, anything said or delivered or left. You tell me immediately." He paused. "And you're not out here alone at night." She looked at him. "I've been alone here for 3 years." "I know," he said. "I'm asking you to be careful." She understood the difference between being told what to do by someone who wanted authority over her and being asked to be careful by someone who had a specific, concrete reason for the concern. She knew which of those this was. "I'll lock the doors," she said, "and I have my father's rifle and I know how to use it." "Good," he said. He meant it simply, without surprise or the faint condescension that men sometimes produced when women mentioned weapons. He just nodded, like of course she does. She walked him to his horse. The afternoon was settling into that particular golden stillness before the light went. "Sheriff," she said, as he checked the stirrup. He looked back at her. "The man in the dry creek bed," she said carefully. "The witness. In San Angelo." He was still for a moment. "His name was Carver," he said. "Billy Carver. He was 31 years old and he had a wife and 2 small children." "I'm sorry," she said. "So am I," he said. "Every day." He mounted up and rode east toward where the tracks had stopped at her fence line, probably to look at something again, to check the measurements in his head against what was there. She watched him go and thought about a man who carried a 31-year-old's name in his chest every day and had spent 5 years in a small town building a scale of justice he could actually manage. She thought, this man is going to need to be careful too. She thought, I should tell him that. She thought, I'll tell him tomorrow. She went back inside and picked up the hammer she'd left leaning against the fence post, because there was still the south section of fence to check before dark. And Cora Whitmore had never once left work unfinished because she was afraid of what was on the other side of it. She walked the fence line as the light went gold, and then amber, and then started, very slowly, to give up. And she checked every post and every wire and found, at the southernmost corner, a place where the wire had been nicked. Just nicked, not cut, not yet. In a way that could have been weather or animals, or could have been a man with a pair of cutting pliers making a small, preliminary decision. She stood at that fence corner for a long moment. Then she went inside, wrote down the location, and what she'd found and the date in the small notebook she'd put in the box with the other papers, locked it, and sat at the kitchen table and listened to the quiet of her father's house around her. The kind of quiet, she thought, that was about to get considerably louder. Part 3. The Fight for Her Land. The nicked wire bothered her more than she let herself admit. Not because it was dramatic, it wasn't. A small cut in the fence wire at the south corner, barely visible unless you were looking for it. The kind of thing that in another season, another year, she would have attributed to a branch or a rock and repaired without a second thought. But she was looking for it now because Elias had told her to look, and what she'd found sat in her chest like a splinter too deep to press out. She wrote it down. She measured the location from the corner post, paced it off, noted the approximate depth of the nick. She did this methodically, the way her father had taught her to do things she didn't want to do. Without feeling, just the recording of fact, because the feeling could wait until the fact was secured. Then she repaired the wire herself, alone, in the last of the afternoon light, and stood back and looked at it, and thought about a man 8 miles east of here who had maps spread on a mahogany desk with her property marked in red ink. She slept badly again that night. Not from fear exactly, or not only from fear. From the particular restlessness of a person who has just understood the full shape of a problem and can't yet see the full shape of the solution. Elias came by the next afternoon as he'd said he would. She showed him the notebook, the recorded measurements, the repaired section of fence. He crouched down and looked at the wire where the nick had been and ran his thumb along it and said nothing for a moment. "Good repair," he said finally. "My father showed me." "Did you save the piece you cut out?" She had. It was in the barn, in a tin can on the workbench, which was where she put hardware pieces she didn't want to lose. She hadn't known she was saving it as evidence. She had just saved it because it was a piece of wire, and throwing away useful wire was something her father would have considered wasteful, and she had never lost the habit. She brought it to him. He turned it in his fingers and looked at the cut. "This wasn't weather," he said. "The angle's wrong for a branch, and it's too clean for a rock." He looked up at her. "Somebody did this with a blade. Something small, like a penknife." "A penknife doesn't cut wire," she said. "No," he agreed, "but it could score it, weaken it. Come back later and apply some pressure, and it gives." He paused. "If a section of your south fence failed and you lost cattle onto your neighbor's land or onto the road, that's a problem for you. A dispute. Potentially expensive." "I don't have cattle," she said. "No. So that particular play wouldn't have worked as well as whoever did this thought it might." He pocketed the piece of wire. "But it tells me something about the approach. It's small. It's incremental. It's the kind of thing where you look at each piece and you can't quite call it criminal because each piece by itself is ambiguous." "Until there are enough pieces," Cora said. "Until there are enough pieces." He stood up. "That's how Harrow operates. I found the same pattern on 2 of the properties he acquired. The Dunbar place, Tom Dunbar told me when I pressed him, that in the 2 months before he sold, he had 3 fencing problems, a water source go bad, and 2 of his horses came up lame within a week of each other. He attributed it to bad luck. Sold to Harrow for 60 cents on the dollar because he was already behind on repairs." Cora thought about Tom Dunbar, who was 63 years old and had farmed that property for 30 years. She had bought eggs from him occasionally. He had a deliberate, careful manner, and she had always thought of him as a man not easily rattled. The idea that he had been slowly, methodically rattled into selling everything he'd built over 3 decades made the anger in her chest expand into something larger and less containable. "Has he told you this officially?" she asked. "Would he make a statement?" "I've asked him," Elias said. "He's afraid." "Of Harrow?" "Of being called a fool who couldn't manage his own land," Elias said quietly. "That's the other thing Harrow's good at. He makes the people he targets feel like the problem is their own poor judgment, like they were going to fail anyway and he just offered them an exit." Cora was quiet for a moment. Then, "What about the woman? The widow with the contract she didn't understand?" "Clara Monroe. Lives in town now, in those rooms above the tailors. Harrow sold her a small house in exchange for the land, part of the agreement. She can't leave without forfeiting the house, and she signed away any right to contest the original sale." He paused. "Beecham drafted the contract." "And she didn't have her own lawyer look at it." She couldn't afford one, he said flatly, and Beecham told her it was standard. Cora sat with all of this. The weight of it was specific and personal in a way that the general fact of Victor Harrow's existence hadn't been before. These were people she could name, people whose eggs she'd bought, whose rooms above the tailor she'd walked past. The operation he'd run against them was patient and careful and utterly without anything resembling conscience. "I want to talk to Clara Monroe," she said. Elias looked at her. "That could upset Harrow's people if they hear about it." "Let it," she said. He was quiet for a second. "All right, but carefully, and not alone." He paused. "I'll walk you over tomorrow morning." The next morning, Cora put on her plain day dress, the brown wool one that said nothing about dancing or optimism, and met Elias at the end of her road at 8 o'clock, and they walked into town together. They weren't quiet this time. Elias talked about what he'd found in the county records the previous evening. 2 additional transactions he'd traced to Beecham's office that didn't appear in the public land registry the way they should have, and Cora asked questions and listened and built the picture in her head alongside him. They were, she noticed, doing this together, not him informing her and her receiving the information, building it together, her questions shaping his direction and his details shaping her understanding. She couldn't recall in recent memory having a conversation with a man that felt quite so much like an exchange between equals. Clara Monroe was a small, fine-boned woman in her 60s with careful eyes and the posture of someone who had trained herself not to look frightened. She received them in her sitting room, which was tidy and impersonal in the way furnished rooms always were, with a few of her own things placed carefully among the landlord's furniture, as if trying to establish a claim to the space. She knew why they'd come. She could see it in how she settled herself in the chair opposite them, hands folded in her lap, chin level, not resigned exactly, but prepared. "I signed what I signed," she said, before either of them had asked anything. "Yes, ma'am," Elias said. "I'm not here to tell you that you did anything wrong." Something moved through her expression, just briefly, a crack in the prepared surface. "He was very convincing," she said. "Mr. Beecham. He was very calm about it. He said it was routine, said everyone signed things like this, said the house was worth more than the land anyway." She paused. "I believed him because I wanted to, because I was tired, and the roof on the main house had been leaking for 2 years, and I didn't have anyone to help me fix it, and I was tired." Cora thought, there it is. That's the mechanism. Not just pressure, not just trickery, exhaustion. Finding the people who were worn down to the point where an exit looked like relief. "What would you need," Cora said carefully, "to be willing to talk about it officially? To a federal marshal?" Clara looked at her steadily. "Why would you be asking that?" "Because I think what happened to you happened to Tom Dunbar, and at least one other person in this county, and it's going to keep happening unless someone stops it," Cora said. "And I think the only way to stop it is to build enough of a picture that the federal authorities can't look away from it." A long silence. "He owns this house," Claire said. "Beecham's firm manages it." "I know," Elias said. "If I cause trouble—" "I'm aware of the risk," Elias said. "I won't pretend it doesn't exist. What I can tell you is that if we get federal involvement, Harrow's hold on these contracts becomes a legal question, not just a practical one, and federal marshals have longer reaches than county sheriffs." Clara looked at her folded hands, then at Cora. "How long have you had your land?" "Born there," Cora said. "My father broke that ground." "Mine too," Clara said quietly. "Mine too." She was silent for another moment. Then, "Let me think on it. Give me 2 days." They thanked her and left. On the street outside, Elias walked beside her without speaking for half a block. Then, "You did well in there." "I didn't do anything," Cora said. "I just told her the truth." "That was the thing to do," he said simply. They were passing the hardware store when she saw Holt Mercer coming out of the bank on the opposite side of the street. He saw her at the same moment. He stopped. His eyes moved to Elias beside her, and something happened in his expression. A rapid recalculation, the look of a man reassessing a situation he thought he'd understood. He touched his hat brim and kept walking. "He's going to tell Harrow that you came into town with me," Elias said, without looking at her. "Good," Cora said. "Let him think about that." 3 days passed without incident. which should have been reassuring and wasn't. Cora found herself checking the fence line morning and evening, walking the perimeter of the property in a methodical circuit that her father had done for different reasons. His had been the ordinary vigilance of a farmer knowing his land, and hers was something more deliberate and less peaceful. She found nothing else unusual, no new fence damage, no one on the road watching the property. The quiet settled over the days like a held breath. On the fourth day, Clara Monroe sent a note to the sheriff's office. 2 sentences. "I'll talk. Tell me when." Elias brought the note to Cora personally, walking out to the property in the evening after his rounds. She read it and felt something in her chest ease just slightly, the way tension eases not when a problem is solved, but when the path forward becomes visible. "Tom Dunbar," she said. "Will he come forward too?" "I'm going to try him again," Elias said. "With Clara committed, it's stronger. 2 people corroborating a pattern is different from 1. He sat down on the porch step. She'd brought out 2 cups of coffee without asking, and he'd taken one without comment, which was becoming the natural shape of these conversations, and looked out at the evening fields. "I've written to the federal marshal's office in Austin, laid out what I have. They want more before they'll send anyone." "How much more?" "Documentation of the fence tampering, the recorded pattern on the other properties, ideally a statement from someone who can directly connect Harrow's instructions to the specific intimidation tactics." He paused. "That last part is the hard one. Harrow doesn't write those instructions down. He uses people like Mercer to communicate them, and Mercer can always claim he didn't know what he was doing." "What about Mercer himself?" Cora said. "If he's afraid of what happens when this comes apart, he's more afraid of Harrow than of federal charges right now," Elias said. "That can change. Fear has a direction, and that direction can shift. But it needs something to shift it." He said it in a way that suggested he already had something in mind and was deciding whether to share it yet. And she had learned his silences well enough in these past days to leave this one alone. He'd say it when he'd worked it through. She looked at the eastern fence line and the dimming light. Somewhere beyond that fence, 8 miles on, Victor Harrow was at a mahogany desk with her land marked in red ink. And he was adjusting his plans, and he was patient, and he had money and lawyers and time. She had 20 acres and a notebook full of careful observations, and a sheriff who was building something from whatever materials the situation offered. She thought, it's going to have to be enough. It almost was, but it took 3 more weeks and things got worse before they got better. The first escalation came on a Tuesday, 9 days after Clara Monroe's note. Cora was in the north field checking the early spring growth on the section she'd planted with winter wheat when she heard horses on the road. Not one horse, several. She straightened and turned. 2 men she didn't know were at her gate. Not at the road, at the gate, inside the property line, which meant they had opened the gate and ridden through it without invitation or permission, and they were sitting their horses with the particular loose-limbed ease of men who were accustomed to going where they wanted. The larger of the 2 was built like a problem you couldn't reason with, broad through the chest, heavy-featured, with the kind of stillness that wasn't calm but was its absence. The other one was leaner and younger and had a way of looking at things sideways, assessing, that she didn't like at all. "Miss Whitmore," the larger one said. Not asking, identifying. She kept the distance between them, set her feet, and said, "You're on private property." "We just need a minute of your time," he said. His voice had the particular smooth quality of a man who practiced his voice. "Mr. Harrow asked us to come by and have a conversation." "Mr. Harrow can have a conversation with my fence line," she said, "which is where you're going to be in about 30 seconds. The lean one smiled. Not a good smile. The kind of smile that was meant to communicate that he found something amusing that she wasn't going to find amusing at all. "Mr. Harrow's prepared to make a substantially improved offer," the larger one said, ignoring her entirely. "Given the changed circumstances." Nothing's changed," she said. "I think you might find the number more persuasive than the last one." "Numbers don't persuade me," she said. "My answer is no. It was no the first time, and it was no when I sent Mr. Mercer off my property, and it's no right now. You can tell Mr. Harrow that the number doesn't matter." The lean one had moved his horse slightly to the left while the other man was talking, not dramatically, just a few steps, the casual repositioning of a man who was creating an angle. Cora tracked it in her peripheral vision and felt the very specific cold alertness of someone who has just registered that a situation has a shape they didn't initially recognize. She was standing in the middle of a field with two strange men on horseback and no one in calling distance. "Ma'am," the lean one said from his new position, "I think you should take some time to really consider what's being offered. Things can get complicated for a woman running a property on her own. Unexpected problems come up." There it was. Not subtle. They hadn't been sent here to be subtle. "Are you threatening me?" she said. Her voice was perfectly level. She was surprised by this in some distant part of herself because she was not perfectly level, but her voice was doing what she needed it to do. "No, ma'am," the lean one said pleasantly. "Just observing that life can be difficult, property maintenance especially, fences, structures." He glanced at the barn behind her. "Fires, sometimes, in dry conditions." "Get off my land," Cora said. Neither of them moved. "I'd hate for you to have a season of bad luck," the lean one said. "I've seen it happen to folks out here. One thing after another wears a person down." "I said get off my land." "We'll take your answer back to Mr. Harrow," the larger one said calmly, as if she hadn't spoken at all. "He may want to send someone to discuss it further." They turned their horses and rode back through the gate at a leisurely pace, leaving it hanging open behind them as they went. Cora stood in the field and watched them until they were out of sight on the east road, and then she walked very carefully and steadily to the gate and closed it and latched it and put her back against the fence post and let herself breathe for a full minute. Her hands were not shaking this time. She wasn't sure if that was courage or just her body understanding that there wasn't time for shaking. She reached into her skirt pocket for the small notebook she'd taken to carrying, uncapped the pencil, and wrote down both men's descriptions: build, height, coloring, the horses they were riding, which direction they came from and left toward, and the exact words that had been used. She wrote it all down while it was fresh, the way her father had taught her to write down weather observations right after you made them, because memory softened the edges. Then she walked to the house, got her father's rifle from the rack above the fireplace, checked that it was loaded, and set it next to the door. Then she walked the half-mile to the road and the 3 miles into town to find Elias. She found him at the sheriff's office, sitting at his desk with a stack of papers he was reading, with the focused frown of a man finding things he didn't like. He looked up when she came in. She was dusty from the road, and she was walking with the particular purposeful stride of a woman who had made up her mind about several things simultaneously. She sat down across from him, put the notebook on the desk, and told him everything. He listened without moving. His expression did what it always did when he was processing something that disturbed him. It went very still, the way water goes still right before it goes somewhere fast. When she finished, he picked up the notebook and read what she'd written. "The lean one," he said, younger, assessing manner, moved his horse to create an angle. "Yes. That sounds like Frank Daly. He works for Harrow directly, not through any intermediary I can identify. That's a different level of involvement." He set the notebook down. "The other one is probably Cy Brennan. He's Daly's regular partner. You know them. I know of them. They've been connected to 2 other land disputes in the adjacent county. Nothing that stuck." He was quiet for a moment. Daly making a direct threat, mentioning fire. "He was careful," Cora said. "Careful enough to call it an observation. I'd hate for you to have bad luck. Fires happen in dry conditions." "I know how it works," Elias said. His voice had gone to a particular flatness that she recognized now as not the absence of emotion, but its containment. He was angry. He was just very controlled about it. "This is the escalation I expected, and I don't have enough to hold them on yet." "I know," she said. "Cora." He had started using her first name sometime in the past week, without announcement, and she had let it happen because it was the name her friends used, and he had become, she recognized, a friend. Not only that, but a friend at minimum. "I need you to stay in town tonight." She looked at him. "Not because you can't protect yourself," he said immediately. "Because being on that property alone right now, when Harrow's just confirmed he's willing to escalate, I'm not going to let him drive me off my own land," she said. "For one night," he said, "while I figure out the next step." She held his gaze for a moment. "Ruth Hadley will have questions." "Ruth Hadley has questions about everything," he said. "Stay with Margaret Finch if you'd rather. She won't ask anything." Margaret Finch was 17 and would be thrilled to the point of speechlessness to have Cora in her family's house, which was actually exactly what Cora needed. Someone who would ask no questions and simply be comforting through the medium of enthusiastic, uncomplicated warmth. "One night," Cora said. "One night," he agreed. She stayed at the Finch house. Margaret did not ask questions. She made biscuits and talked about a young man named Peter who worked at the mill and whose feelings for her were apparently considerable, and Cora listened and ate biscuits and felt the tension in her shoulders slowly, stubbornly begin to release. She was back at her property at sunrise. Nothing had been touched. She checked the entire perimeter before she did anything else, walking every fence line, checking the barn, checking the house. Everything was as she'd left it. Either Harrow had not sent anyone in the night, or the fact of a light burning at the Finch house and the property sitting dark had made someone hesitate. She was in the kitchen making coffee when she heard a horse and looked out the window and saw Elias coming up the road faster than his usual pace. She met him at the gate. He had something in his expression she hadn't seen before. Not alarm, but urgency. A kind of coiled alertness that made her straighten instinctively. "I talked to Holt Mercer last night," he said. She waited. "Late. He came to the office. I don't know what changed his mind. Maybe he heard about Daly and Brennan coming here. Maybe he understood something about how this was going to end that he hadn't understood before." He stopped himself from whatever else he might have said and stuck to the facts. "He talked, Cora. Not everything, but enough." She felt something shift in the air. "How much is enough?" "He told me about a meeting he was present for 6 months ago at Harrow's property. Harrow Beecham, 2 other men. He was there as... He described himself as a kind of errand runner, which I think is how he let himself be comfortable with what he was hearing. He said Harrow laid out the entire acquisition strategy for the Eastern Corridor properties, including yours, including the railroad information, including what he called alternative approaches for reluctant sellers." He paused. "And he named a specific thing that Harrow said about your property specifically." "What did he say?" Elias looked at her steadily. "He said that if the Whitmore woman wouldn't sell, she'd eventually understand that holding out would cost her more than letting go, that she had no family to fall back on, no husband, no resources beyond the property itself, and that a sustained campaign of property difficulty would eventually make the land not worth the cost of keeping it." The precise, calculated coldness of it was almost impressive in its ugliness. No anger in it, no personal animosity, just a man treating another human being as a variable in a financial equation, deciding the most efficient method of making that variable resolve in his favor. "Mercer was in that room," Cora said. "He was in that room," Elias confirmed. "And he stood outside your house 6 weeks later and asked you to the Founders' Dance." She held that for a moment. Set it in the part of her mind where she kept things that were true and necessary to know, even though they were terrible. Filed it there with care, the way you handle something that could cut you. "Will he say this to a federal marshal?" "He says he will," Elias said. "I don't know if I fully trust that until he does. But I wrote to Austin last night. What Mercer gave me, combined with what Clara Monroe has, combined with the fence documentation and Daly's direct threat, which you wrote down within an hour of it happening," he paused. "I think we have enough to get someone to come." "How long?" 10 days, maybe 2 weeks. Possibly less if I can get the right person in Austin to read the letter in the right order." 10 days. 2 weeks. A sustained campaign of property difficulty, Harrow had said. He'd had 6 months to plan this. He'd already escalated once. "He'll do something before then," she said. "I expect so," Elias said. "That's why I'm going to ask you something, and I want you to know that I'm asking, not telling." She looked at him. "I want to be here," he said. "On the property, at night, for now, until this resolves. Not in the house. I'll sleep in the barn, or I can camp the south field, whatever you're comfortable with, but present." He held her gaze with the same steadiness he brought to everything. "You shouldn't be handling this alone, and I can't be here in the daytime and across town at night and respond fast enough if something happens." She thought about the 2 men on horses in her field, the lean one moving to create an angle, the casual reference to fire. She thought about Elias Vance, who had arrived at her door on the night she thought the evening was ruined and had turned out to be something entirely other than what she'd expected. "There's a cot in the tack room," she said, "blanket on the hook beside the door." Something moved through his face. Not relief. Something quieter than that. "Thank you." "Don't thank me," she said. "I'm being practical." He almost smiled. "Of course." That night, and the 5 nights following, she cooked for 2 without commenting on it, and he ate without making it a thing. And they fell into the strange, specific rhythm of 2 people sharing a space without sharing it, each maintaining their own territory, while the larger territory of the situation held them in the same orbit. He checked the fence line at dusk. She checked it at dawn. They compared notes over coffee in the mornings. He rode into town for his duties and came back before dark. On the 3rd evening, he was later than usual, and she was sitting on the porch with her father's rifle across her knees when he came up the road, and he saw her and the rifle and stopped for just a second in a way she thought was about more than the rifle. "Anything?" she asked. "Dunbar," he said, swinging down from his horse. "Tom Dunbar came to the office today." She sat up straighter. "He'll talk," Elias said. He said, "He sat in my office for about 10 minutes before he could start, and then he said that he'd spent 70 years on this earth building a name that meant something, and he wasn't going to finish the rest of it knowing he'd stayed quiet while the same thing happened to someone else." He tied the horse to the post and came to sit on the step below her. He cried a little, telling it. He was embarrassed about that. "He shouldn't be," Cora said. "No," Elias agreed. He was quiet for a moment, looking out at the darkening fields. 3 statements. Yours for the fence tampering and the threat. Clara's for the contract fraud. Tom's for the sustained property campaign. He paused. And Mercer's, if he holds. "Is there anything else you need?" He turned to look up at her. The evening light caught his face at an angle that showed the tiredness in it, the specific fatigue of a man who had been running on purpose and determination and not enough sleep for over a week. There was something else there, too, something she had been watching build slowly and carefully across these days of shared purpose, the way you watch a structure take shape, each piece necessary, each piece deliberate, the whole thing becoming visible gradually. "No," he said, "I think we have what we need." He looked back at the fields. "I want it to be enough." "It will be," she said. She meant it as a practical assessment, and she did mean it that way, but she heard something else in it when it landed between them. Something that was also about him and her, and whatever was quietly, carefully assembling itself in the space of these mornings and evenings. He heard it too. She could tell by the way he didn't respond immediately, by the half-second of stillness before he said simply, "Yeah." On the 7th night, she woke to the smell of smoke. She was out of bed and at the window before she was fully awake, operating on something animal and immediate. And she could see the orange flicker from the south end of the property, and her brain said, "barn," before the rest of her had caught up. And then she was pulling on her boots and grabbing the rifle, and she was out the door and already shouting his name. Elias was already out of the tack room when she reached the barn, already moving toward the south fence line, where the orange light was flickering from a pile of dry brush that had been stacked against the fence post. Not the barn, not the house, not anything structural, just the fence, dry brush piled against the post at the most southerly point of the property and set alight. He had water from the trough to it in under 2 minutes. She had the second bucket. They put it out. It wasn't large, it hadn't had time, and stood in the dark with the smell of wet char and adrenaline, and Elias held the lantern down to the ground, and they could both see the boot tracks in the soft earth. 2 sets, coming from the east, retreating the same direction. "Daly and Brennan," she said. "Most likely," he said. She looked at the scorched fence post, at the tracks retreating east. "They wanted me to see it," she said. "Not burn down the fence. Just make sure I saw it." "Yes," he said. "A reminder. A preview." He crouched down and looked at the tracks more closely. "They didn't try to hide themselves." "Because they don't think I can do anything about it." He stood up. In the lantern light, his expression was very clear and very settled. "They're wrong," he said. She believed him. Not because she needed to believe something in this moment, not because he was saying it to reassure her. because he had spent 7 nights sleeping on a cot in her tack room and 8 days building a case piece by careful piece. And the man who did that was not a man making empty promises. She looked at the scorched earth and the wet charcoal of the brush pile and the retreating boot tracks and felt the anger in her settle into something colder and more purposeful than anger. Not the clean, hot fury of earlier weeks, something slower and more determined. "Write it down," Elias said quietly. "I already am," she said, and she had the notebook out. The letter from Austin arrived 4 days later. Part 4. Justice, Truth, and a New Beginning. The letter from Austin was not what Elias had hoped for. He read it twice, standing at his desk in the sheriff's office, before he folded it back along its crease and set it down with the careful deliberateness of a man who needed a moment before he responded to something. Then he read it a third time, more slowly, looking for the thing he might have missed that would make it say something different than what it said. It didn't say something different. Federal Marshal District Office, Austin, Texas, signed by a Deputy Chief Marshal named Aldous Crane, acknowledging receipt of Sheriff Vance's communication dated the 14th, noting the seriousness of the allegations, advising that the district office was currently managing a significant caseload and that the matter would be assigned to an available marshal at the earliest opportunity, recommending that Sheriff Vance continue to compile evidence and maintain local order in the interim. Continue to compile evidence, like he'd been collecting pressed flowers. He went to Cora's property that afternoon. She was in the kitchen garden, which she attacked when she was working through something, and she was working through something. He'd sent word about the letter by Tommy Briggs before coming himself, because he'd learned that she preferred to absorb information before she had to respond to it in front of anyone, even him. By the time he arrived, she'd had 2 hours with it, and she was on her third row. "How long?" she asked, without stopping what she was doing. "Crane didn't give a timeline," he said. "That's what concerns me." "It concerns me, too." She sat back on her heels, pulled off her gardening gloves. "Harrow will hear about the letter. He'll have someone at the county courthouse, someone at the post office. I don't know, but a man who has operated this carefully for this long has ears in the places that matter. He'll know Austin hasn't moved yet." "Yes," Elias said, "which means the window we have before he tries something significant is narrower than I'd like." She looked up at him. "How narrow?" "I don't know. A week? Maybe less?" He crouched down to be at her level, his forearms on his knees. "I've been thinking about Beecham." She waited. "Beecham is a lawyer," Elias said, "which means he has a bar association, which means he has something to lose that Harrow can't protect him from if the fraud on Clara Monroe's contract becomes an official complaint to the Texas bar." He paused. "That's not federal. That's state. It moves on a different timeline, and it goes to a different set of people." Cora was quiet for a moment, turning this over. If Beecham panics, if Beecham understands that the bar complaint is coming regardless, and that his best position is to cooperate before rather than after. He stopped. "Lawyers are interesting when their license is at stake. It tends to clarify their thinking about where their loyalties actually lie." "Can you file the complaint yourself?" "Clara has to file it," he said, "but I can sit with her while she does it, and I can make sure it's filed with the right office in a way that gets looked at quickly." He paused. "I know a man in the state attorney's office. Not well, but enough. He owes me a conversation." She looked at him steadily. "When?" "Today," he said. "If Clara will do it today." Clara Monroe did it that afternoon. She sat at Elias's desk in the sheriff's office with Cora beside her and wrote out the complaint in her careful, schooled handwriting. The fraudulent representation, the contract terms she hadn't understood, the pressure to sign without independent counsel, the specific statements Beecham had made about the nature of the agreement. She wrote it like a woman who had been waiting for the right moment to put it somewhere permanent. And when she finished and signed it, she set down the pen and sat very straight in the chair and said nothing. "Thank you," Cora said. "Don't thank me yet," Clara said. "Thank me when that man loses something." Elias dispatched the complaint by courier that evening along with a personal letter to his contact in the state attorney's office, a man named Raymond Holt, who had been a territorial deputy back when Elias was marshal work, and who had a long memory and a short tolerance for what he called men of commerce using the law as a private tool. Whether Raymond Holt would move quickly was not a certainty, but he would move. 2 days passed. On the third day, Beecham came to Millfield. He arrived on the morning stage, which was unusual. Beecham operated out of a town called Redwater, 30 miles south, and his visits to Millfield had always been arranged in advance around specific business. An unannounced visit on the morning stage meant he'd made a fast decision about something. Elias saw him at the stage depot and walked over before Beecham had finished collecting his case from the driver. Beecham was a trim man in his 50s, silver-haired, with the precisely maintained appearance of a man whose clothes were his first argument in any negotiation. He was also, Elias had learned over the past weeks, a man who was very good at not showing what he felt. But there was something off about him this morning, a tightness around the eyes, a slight stiffness in the way he moved. "Sheriff," Beecham said, with the measured warmth of someone deploying a skill. "I was going to stop by your office." "You're here," Elias said. "We can talk now." Beecham looked around the depot. The stage driver, 2 other passengers, a boy loading parcels. "Somewhere private might be better." "My office is private," Elias said. Beecham came to the sheriff's office and sat in the chair across the desk and spent approximately 45 seconds establishing his composure before he said, in a tone carefully calibrated to sound like an opening to a reasonable discussion, rather than what it actually was. "I understand there's been a complaint filed with the state bar." "There has," Elias said. "I want to discuss it." "I'm not the state bar," Elias said, "but I'm willing to listen." What followed was one of the stranger conversations Elias had had in 5 years of managing this town. Beecham didn't confess. He didn't apologize. He didn't do anything so uncalculated as that. What he did was construct, very carefully, a version of events in which his role in the acquisition of Clara Monroe's property had been the result of client instructions he'd been uncomfortable with but had followed because that was his professional obligation, and in which he had documentation, he used the word carefully, placing it like a card, that would support the characterization of Harrow as the primary architect of any problematic arrangements. Elias listened to all of it without expression. "What you're describing," he said when Beecham had finished, "sounds like a man who has written things down." "I keep thorough records," Beecham said, "as any reputable attorney must. Records of instructions from Harrow. Records of the full course of any client engagement," Beecham said precisely, "which would include communications, instructions, and any concerns I may have noted regarding those instructions." "You noted concerns," Elias said. "At various points," Beecham said. "Yes." Elias looked at him for a long moment. Beecham held it reasonably well. He was a man who'd spent 30 years in rooms where other men tried to read him, and he was accustomed to being looked at carefully without it costing him much. "Mr. Beecham," Elias said, "I'm going to be direct with you because I think you're a man who operates better with directness than with implication. Federal interest in Victor Harrow's land acquisition activities in this county is a matter of when, not if. The state bar complaint is already filed, and my understanding is it will be reviewed within the fortnight. There is a pattern of documented property interference on record, and there are 3 individuals who have given statements about specific incidents directly connected to Harrow's operation." He paused. "The people who cooperate early in federal investigations tend to have different experiences than the people who cooperate late or not at all. That's not a threat. It's an observation about how these things historically proceed." Beecham was quiet for a moment. Something moved behind his eyes, the recalculation of a man who had arrived with one set of terms and was discovering they weren't applicable. "If I were to make certain documentation available," Beecham said carefully. "Hypothetically." "If you were to make documentation available," Elias said, "you would want to do that through the proper channels, with appropriate understanding about your position, which I can facilitate if you'd like to proceed that way." A pause. "How soon would you need to know my decision?" "I'd say 3 days at the outside," Elias said. "After that, circumstances may not allow for the same range of options." Beecham picked up his case. He looked for just a moment like what he was, A man of 60 who had made a series of choices over a long period of time and had woken up one morning to find those choices had a cumulative shape he hadn't entirely intended. "I'll be in touch," he said. He was in touch in 36 hours. Through a message delivered by his clerk, addressed to the sheriff's office, 3 lines only. He had documentation he was prepared to share. He wanted to understand his position before doing so. He was available to meet. Elias brought Cora with him to that meeting. He hadn't planned to. He'd been turning it over and had decided that her presence served a practical purpose. She was a directly aggrieved party with direct knowledge of the timeline, and Beecham, knowing that she was present and informed, would make certain kinds of evasion more difficult. That was the practical purpose. He didn't entirely examine the rest of it. Beecham was surprised to see her. He covered it quickly, the way he covered most things, but it was there for a half second. The blink, the very slight reset. Then he nodded and said, "Miss Whitmore." And she nodded back and sat down and said nothing, just looked at him with the level, unadorned attention that he was beginning to understand was one of her most effective qualities. She didn't perform composure. She just was composed, which was considerably harder to argue with. The meeting took 2 hours. By the end of it, Beecham had placed on the table, literally, a stack of papers he'd carried in his case, copies of written instructions from Victor Harrow's office to Beecham's firm covering a 14-month period. Instructions about the sequencing of acquisition approaches. Instructions about contract terms and which ones to emphasize and which to obscure in the presentation to sellers. A specific written note in Harrow's handwriting about the Whitmore property. The same note that Mercer had described from memory during his conversation with Elias, now in documented form with Harrow's signature. If the Whitmore woman requires alternative persuasion, coordinate with Daly. 6 words that connected Victor Harrow directly to Frank Daly, to the men on horseback in Cora's field, to the pile of burning brush at the south fence post. Cora read those 6 words and was very still for a moment. Then she said, "He put it in writing." "Successful men get comfortable," Elias said quietly. After a while, they stop expecting to be held accountable. That was the thing that had sustained Harrow's operation across years in multiple counties, Elias thought. Not just money or lawyers, but the accumulated confidence of a man who had never once experienced a consequence. Every property he'd acquired, every family he'd pressured or deceived or simply exhausted into selling, had confirmed the same lesson, that the rules that constrained ordinary people were, for him, negotiable, that patience and money could dissolve almost any resistance. He had not until now encountered resistance that was also building a case. Elias contacted Raymond Holt in Austin that evening with the new documentation. Holt's response came back faster than anything Austin had managed so far. Within 24 hours. 2 federal marshals would be arriving in Millfield within 4 days. They wanted all available documentation organized, and they wanted witness statements formalized. Cora spent 2 of those 4 days at Elias's office helping organize the paperwork. She had a systematic mind for it. She sorted chronologically, cross-referenced documents against statements, flagged inconsistencies that needed clarification before the marshals arrived. She worked with her coat off and her sleeves rolled to the elbow, and she drank her coffee black, and she caught an error in the transcription of Clara's statement that would have caused problems later, and Elias watched her work and thought about a woman who had spent 3 years alone on 20 acres managing everything herself and had turned out to be exactly the kind of person that circumstances like this required. The morning the federal marshals arrived, Millfield took notice. 2 strangers in good clothes riding in on well-kept horses, going directly to the sheriff's office, being there for the better part of 3 hours. The town's attention was inevitable, and Elias had expected it and didn't try to manage it. Some things you couldn't manage. You just did the thing as cleanly as possible and let the attention follow where it would. The marshals were professional and thorough and not warm. That was fine. Warmth wasn't what was needed. What was needed was someone with federal authority to review what Elias had built, and they did that. And at the end of 3 hours, Marshal Prentice, the senior of the 2, a compact man with a gray beard and eyes that had done a lot of reading of situations, said, "This is sufficient to proceed." 3 words that landed in the office like something solid. "We'll need to take statements from your witnesses today and tomorrow," Prentice said, "and we'll be riding to the Harrow property the following morning. I'll come with you." Elias said. Prentice looked at him briefly. "We'll accept the company," he said, which was, Elias understood, as close to yes as federal marshals got when dealing with town sheriffs on matters that had crossed their jurisdiction. The witness statements took all of that day and half of the next. Claire Monroe sat across from Marshal Prentice's junior, a man named Welks, who wrote in a small, precise hand, and gave her account without embellishment or apology for 90 minutes. Tom Dunbar came in the afternoon, his hat in his hands, and did the same, and there was a point in the middle of his account where his voice gave out briefly, and he stopped for a moment and pushed through it, and nobody in the room said anything about that. Mercer was last. He arrived 20 minutes late, and he came in with the particular hunched quality of a man who is doing something that is right, and costing him considerably. And he sat down, and he talked for 2 hours. He gave the meeting. He gave the names. He gave the timeline. He gave Harrow's instructions, as he remembered them, about every property on the Eastern Corridor list. He talked about Cora specifically, the assignment he'd been given, the courtship approach, the note he'd sent the night of the dance. And his voice when he talked about that had a different quality than the rest of it, less the careful recitation of fact, and more the faltering account of a man who understands, too late, what he was part of. He did not look at Cora during any of it. She was in the room because Prentice had asked her to be present as the primary aggrieved party, and she sat against the wall and she listened and she kept her face neutral, and she did not offer him anything. Not absolution, not condemnation, just the fact of her presence, her attention, the recorded acknowledgement of what he was saying. When it was done, Mercer stood up and put his hat on and said, very quietly, without looking at anyone in particular, "I'm sorry, Miss Whitmore." She didn't respond immediately. She let it sit where he'd put it. Then she said, "I know you are." That was all. Not forgiveness, not dismissal. Just the acknowledgement that she believed him, which was the only honest thing she had to offer. The following morning, Elias rode east with Prentice and Welks. He had imagined this moment in various forms over the past weeks, had constructed it in his head during those long evenings in the tack room, listening to the quiet of the property around him and building the case piece by piece in his mind. The arrival at Harrow's gate, the legal authority that would, finally, make what Harrow had done a matter of consequence rather than just of knowledge. It didn't go the way he'd imagined, which in his experience was how things usually went. Harrow was at the property. He received them in a sitting room that was expensively appointed in the way of a man who had decided at some point that visible wealth was a form of argument and had been winning that argument for long enough to believe it. He was 60, perhaps, with silver hair and the kind of build that had been substantial in youth and had shifted into something that still communicated authority without requiring physical power. He looked at the federal badges, and he looked at Elias, and his expression did something that surprised Elias slightly. Not fear, not anger, a kind of tired recognition, like a man who had known this was a direction a road could lead and had taken it anyway, and was now standing at the place the road ended. "I'd like my attorney present," Harrow said. "Mr. Beecham has cooperated with our investigation," Prentice said, with the precise neutrality of a man delivering a single devastating fact. "He is not currently available to represent your interests." The silence that followed that statement was the loudest thing Elias had heard in a long time. Something went out of Harrow's face. Not collapsed. He was not a man who collapsed. But something structural left it. The way a building settles when a foundational element is no longer doing what it was doing, visible in the small shifts of the surface above. "I see," Harrow said. What followed was several hours of the careful, procedural work of federal law, and Elias stood through most of it and participated where his knowledge of the local facts was needed and was otherwise a witness. Harrow was not arrested that day. The process of formal charges would take longer, the federal wheels turning at their own speed. But he was formally notified of the investigation, his documents were collected, and a legal notice was placed on his property acquisitions in the county, pending review of how they had been obtained. It was not the dramatic, immediate reckoning that part of Elias had wanted. It was the law working the way the law actually worked, slowly, with paperwork, with bureaucratic precision. But it was real. It was consequential. It was the shape of something that was not going to stop. He rode back to Millfield in the afternoon with the two marshals, and the marshals went to their accommodations at the boarding house, and Elias went to Cora's property because that was where he went now at the end of the day, and it was only in the last half mile that he examined that fact and understood what it meant. She was on the porch when he came up the road. She'd known when to expect him approximately, and she'd put coffee on, and she had her father's rifle leaning against the porch rail, which she hadn't put away in the past week, and which he hadn't asked her to put away because there was no point asking her to put away a reasonable precaution before there was a reasonable basis for doing so. He tied his horse and came to the porch and sat on the step, and she handed him the coffee, and he drank half of it before he said anything. Beecham's cooperation broke it, he said. The written instruction, Daly's name in Harrow's handwriting, that's the direct connection. What happens now? Federal case. Formal charges probably within 30 days. Harrow's land acquisitions in the county are frozen pending review, which means the contracts he used to take them, Clara's contract, Dunbar's arrangement, will be scrutinized. He paused. The widow's contract will almost certainly be voided. Beecham's bar complaint ensures that. Cora was quiet for a moment. Tom gets his property back? Possibly. The sale agreement may have been clean enough to hold even if the context was coerced. But his specific case will be reviewed. He looked at her. Yours was never in question. No contract was ever signed. No, she said. Because I sent the letter back. He almost smiled. Because you sent the letter back. She looked out at the fields, and the evening light was doing the same thing it did every evening at this hour. That amber shift that was particular to this part of Texas, particular to this property, particular in a way she'd been looking at her whole life without ever having occasion to see it as something she might lose. Daly and Brennan, she said. Prentice wants them, Elias said. The written instruction connecting them to Harrow gives him the basis. They'll be found. She nodded slowly. Then, you did it. We did it, he said. She looked at him. I wrote things in a notebook. You wrote things in a notebook within an hour of events, accurately and completely, in a form that federal marshals could use without question. He set the coffee cup down. You talked to Clara Monroe when I wasn't sure she'd talk. You went back to your property every single morning when you had every reason to stay in town. You held your ground when Daly and Brennan were standing in your field making specific threats, and then you walked 3 miles to come tell me about it, and the way you told it was precise and usable. He paused. I built a case. You were the case. She was quiet for a moment, the sound of the evening settling in, the distant birds, the wind moving through the north field, the particular absence of sound that was this property at peace. Can I ask you something? She said. Yes? Billy Carver, she said. The man in San Angelo. He was still. You've been carrying him for years, she said. I don't know how long. You said every day. Yes, he said. Do you think... She stopped, started again. Do you think what happened here changes anything about that? He thought about that honestly, which was what she deserved. No, he said. Billy Carver is still dead. What I did here doesn't undo that. I don't think it's supposed to. He looked at his hands for a moment. But I think doing this correctly this time matters. Not as a trade, not as payment, just as its own thing. He looked at her. Does that make sense? Yes, she said. That makes a lot of sense. They sat for a while as the light continued its slow business of becoming dark. And somewhere in the middle of that transition, without it being a large or dramatic moment, Elias reached over and took her hand, and she let him. And they sat like that as the last of the amber left the fields and the stars started making their case above the ridge to the west. I should probably stop sleeping in the tack room, he said. Probably, she agreed. It seems like the urgent reason for it is resolving. Yes, he said. The urgent reason. She turned to look at him. He was looking at her. And in the settled, unsentimental honesty of his face, in the steadiness that was not the absence of feeling but its most controlled expression, she saw what she had been watching build across these weeks of shared purpose and early mornings, and the particular intimacy of two people facing the same difficult thing together. There might be other reasons, she said carefully. There might be, he said. You'd have to say so, she said. Clearly, because I've had a recent experience with a man who communicated things through implication, and I find I'm done with that. Something moved through his expression that was very nearly a laugh, not quite, but the genuine precursor to one. Then it settled into something more serious. He looked at her directly. I'd like to continue being present in your life, he said, in whatever form you'd allow, not because you need someone present. I know I don't need it, she said. I know you know, he said, because you're the most self-sufficient person I've met in 5 years of living here, which is actually part of why I'm saying it, because I'm not offering to be necessary. I'm asking if I can be wanted. The honesty of that, the stripped-back, uncomfortable precision of asking if he could be wanted, hit her in a way that the elaborate courtship of Holt Mercer had never come close to touching, because it was exactly what Holt Mercer had never done. He had assumed. He had deployed. He had never once asked. Yes, she said. You can be wanted. He squeezed her hand once, briefly. Then he looked back at the darkening fields and let the moment be what it was without overloading it, which was, she thought, absolutely characteristic of him. The tack room cot is genuinely uncomfortable, he said. I know, she said. I've slept on it once. My father bought it in 1871. That explains a great deal, he said. She laughed. It surprised her slightly, the easy, unguarded quality of it, and he turned at the sound of it with an expression she had not seen on his face before, something open and unguarded and slightly undone, like a man who had not expected that specific sound in that specific moment and found it was more than he'd prepared for. They sat on the porch as the dark came all the way in and the stars arranged themselves in their excessive abundance above the Texas ridge, and somewhere in the distance Millfield went about its evening business, entirely unaware that the two people sitting on this particular porch had just quietly and irrevocably decided something about the rest of their lives. 3 weeks later, Frank Daly and Cy Brennan were taken into custody in a town called Maris, 40 miles north, by federal marshals acting on Prentice's warrant. Victor Harrow was formally charged with land fraud, criminal conspiracy, and property intimidation across 3 counties. Beecham surrendered his law license and his testimony in exchange for reduced exposure. The contracted properties were entered into federal review. Holt Mercer left Millfield on a Wednesday morning with his horse and 2 bags and no forwarding information. Elias watched him go from the window of the sheriff's office and felt nothing in particular about it, which he thought was the appropriate amount to feel. 2 days after Mercer left, Elias walked over to Cora's property on his lunch break, something he did most days now, which the town had noticed and had decided to have opinions about, and he and Cora had both concluded that the town's opinions were the town's to manage, and found her reading a letter at the kitchen table. She looked up when he came in, and her expression was the complicated kind that had several things in it at once. The railroad surveyor's office wrote, she said. He pulled out the chair across from her and sat. They've confirmed the eastern route, she said, through the Dunbar parcel and my 20 acres. She set the letter down. They want to discuss acquisition terms for a right-of-way easement. He looked at her. She looked at him. A right-of-way easement, he said, is not the same as a sale. No, she said. It's not. It's a negotiated access agreement for a portion of the land. I keep the deed. I keep the property. She paused. With compensation. At current fair market value, he said slowly, which is now different, she said. Considerably different from what Harrow was offering. She looked at the letter. Because the route is now public knowledge. The thing that Victor Harrow had kept carefully controlled for 8 months, the railroad information, the real value of these 20 acres, the thing he'd used to justify his entire operation, was now exactly what it would have been if he'd never tried to control it at all. Common knowledge, public information, available to the person who owned the land and could decide what to do with it. Cora set the letter down on the table beside the locked wooden box that still held every piece of documentation from the past 6 weeks. The notebook, the photographs of the scorched fence post that Prentice's man had taken, the correspondence from Beecham's office, the copy of Harrow's 6-word instruction. She kept it all there, not from bitterness, from the same principle her father had taught her about paperwork. It said what it said, regardless of what the man who wrote it wished it had said later. "I'm going to write back to the surveyor's office," she said. "I'm going to tell them I'm available to discuss terms, and I'll be bringing my own representation to any meeting." "Good," Elias said. "I'm going to need a lawyer who isn't Beecham." "Raymond Holt in Austin might know someone," he said. "I'll write to him." She nodded. Then she looked at him across the kitchen table in the plain midday light, with the coffee getting cold between them and the letter from the railroad on the table and the locked box beside it, and she looked like a woman who had held her ground and was still standing on it, which was exactly what she was. "You look tired," she said. "I am tired," he said. "I've been sleeping in a tack room on a cot from 1871. "I know," she said. "I've been thinking about that." She had. She had been thinking about a great many things that involved the longer shape of what came next, now that the immediate crisis had a resolution she could see, now that the ground under her feet was as secure as it had been in months. She had been thinking about it in the early mornings when she did her fence checks, and in the evenings when she sat on the porch, and in the spaces between tasks, when she let herself think about things she wanted rather than things she feared. "I'm going to offer you the south bedroom," she said, "which has a proper bed and a window that faces the morning, as a practical arrangement while there are still legal proceedings that require your presence on or near this property." He looked at her carefully. "A practical arrangement." "That may evolve," she said, "in time." He held her gaze for a long moment. Then, without making it into something it wasn't ready to be yet, he said, "I'll get my blanket from the tack room." "There are spare blankets in the chest," she said. "You don't need to bring the one from 1871. He did, in fact, almost laugh that time. She picked up her coffee and looked at the letter from the railroad surveyor's office and thought about her father, who had broken this ground 30 years ago with his hands and his back and his stubborn, particular refusal to give up on something worth keeping. She thought about what he would make of all of it, the scheme, the fight, the federal marshals, the man who was going to sleep in the south bedroom as a practical arrangement that may evolve in time. She thought he would approve of most of it. The south field still needed its spring inspection. The north fence had a post that was going soft at the base and needed replacing. The letter from the railroad required a thoughtful response. There was coffee to finish and work to do and a life that was, she understood now in the fullest and most grounded sense, worth every bit of the fight it had taken to keep it. She picked up her pen and began to write. Part 5. The Life They Built Together. The response to the railroad surveyor's office took Cora 3 drafts. Not because she didn't know what she wanted to say, but because she wanted to say it precisely, not aggressively, not deferentially, just with the clear, grounded confidence of a woman who understood exactly what she was holding and what it was worth. The first draft was too stiff. The second was too accommodating, a habit from years of adjusting her tone downward when speaking to men in official capacities, a habit she recognized and was actively working to discard. The third was right, professional, direct, specific about her terms for the meeting and her intention to bring independent legal counsel. She sent it. Elias read it before she sealed it and said, "Good." And she'd learned by now that when he said good in that particular register, without elaboration, he meant it without qualification. He had moved his things into the south bedroom over the course of 2 evenings, which amounted to a saddlebag, a change of clothes, a shaving kit, and 3 books that he stacked on the windowsill with the careful organization of a man accustomed to making temporary spaces function. It was not a large collection of belongings for a man who'd been living in a town for 5 years, and Cora noticed this without commenting on it. People who'd moved around a lot learned to travel light. You stopped acquiring things that would have to be packed. The south bedroom had her mother's quilt on the bed, and the morning light came through the east window at an angle that woke you gently rather than abruptly, which was a thing she had always found more efficient than an alarm, because a person who woke gently got out of bed in a better frame of mind for work. She didn't tell him this. He discovered it himself on the second morning and mentioned it over coffee with the mild, slightly surprised tone of a man who had found something unexpectedly good in an ordinary place, and she just said, "My mother knew what she was doing with a window." And that was the extent of that conversation. They managed the household the way they managed everything else, practically, without a lot of discussion about the arrangement itself, just doing the work that the arrangement required. She cooked most evenings. He fixed things. Not because those were their designated roles, but because she was a better cook than he was, and he was, she discovered, extraordinarily competent with a toolbox in a way that suggested he'd spent years maintaining things alone. The specific skill set of a person who couldn't always wait for someone else to come fix something. The soft fence post in the north field was repaired on a Saturday morning with Elias doing the post work and Cora running the new wire, and they worked without talking much and finished in 2 hours and stood back and looked at it, and she thought, this is what it looks like when two people are useful to each other. Not romantic exactly, or not only romantic, something more durable than that. Raymond Holt's contact in Austin was a lawyer named Adelia Marsh, which surprised Cora and then immediately made her feel slightly ashamed of being surprised. Marsh was 40, precise, and expensive, in a way that Cora's budget was going to feel. And she came to Millfield on a Tuesday with a leather case and a manner that communicated she had done this specific kind of negotiation before and found it neither intimidating nor particularly interesting, which was exactly the manner Cora needed across the table from her. The meeting with the railroad surveyor's representative happened on a Thursday at the county clerk's office, neutral ground, which Marsh had specified and Cora had approved. The representative was a man named Stokes, who had done land negotiations for the railroad for 15 years, and who arrived with the comfortable assumption of a man accustomed to dealing with rural landowners who were grateful for the railroad's interest. He recalibrated within approximately 6 minutes of the meeting beginning. Cora sat across from him and let Adelia Marsh do the first 20 minutes of talking, which was the legal framework. Easement parameters, property rights retained, compensation structures, what the railroad could and could not do with the access. Then Stokes made an offer. It was a fair offer by pre-public knowledge standards, which meant it was an offer that would have been appropriate if the railroad route had not been made public 2 months ago, which it had. That figure, Marsh said, reflects a valuation of Miss Whitmore's property that doesn't account for the current market adjustment following the public announcement of the eastern route. Stokes said that the railroad's standard easement compensation was calibrated to land use value rather than market speculation. Marsh said that easement compensation was calibrated to what the landowner was actually giving up, and that what the landowner was giving up was now worth considerably more than the railroad standard table suggested. Cora said clearly and without heat, "Mr. Stokes, I have held this land through a sustained campaign of intimidation by a man who understood its value better than your current offer reflects. I am not in a position to accept a number that doesn't account for that value accurately." Stokes looked at her for a moment. There was something in his expression that she'd seen before in rooms like this. The recalibration of a man who had expected a particular kind of conversation and was getting a different one. Not hostile, just genuinely revised. They went 3 more rounds and reached a number that Adelia Marsh described afterward as within acceptable parameters, which Cora understood to mean it was a good outcome without being a perfect one. She signed the easement agreement with the understanding that a right-of-way across the southern 8 acres would allow the railroad access while she retained the deed, the property, and the substantially increased value of the remaining land. She walked out of the county clerk's office into the afternoon sunshine and stood on the steps for a moment. Elias was leaning against the post at the bottom, waiting. He'd offered to come in with her, and she'd told him she had Marsh for that, but she'd also not told him not to be outside, which they both understood. "Well," he said. "Within acceptable parameters," she said. He looked at her steadily for a moment, reading whatever was in her face. Then, "You're not satisfied." "I'm appropriately satisfied," she said. "It was a good outcome. It wasn't everything I might have wanted in a world where everything goes exactly right." "That world is not the one we live in," he said. "No," she agreed. "But this one's not bad." She came down the steps and they walked back through town together, and she noticed the way people looked at them now. Not with the speculative curiosity of the night of the dance, not with the gossipy interest of 2 weeks into Elias staying at her property, but with something more settled, more accustomed. Like a thing that had started as a topic of conversation had become simply a feature of the landscape. Cora Whitmore and Sheriff Vance. Like a fact. Ruth Hadley waved from across the street with the brightness of a woman who had decided to be unambiguously supportive now that the narrative had arrived at a point she approved of. Cora waved back. She had made a private accommodation with Ruth Hadley over the past months. The woman was who she was, and what she was included a genuine warmth underneath the incessant social processing, and Cora had decided that genuine warmth, even wrapped in the complicated packaging of Ruth Hadley, was worth something. Victor Harrow's formal federal charges were filed 6 weeks after the marshal's visit. The case was extensively documented in the regional papers and in the Austin papers, and Cora read the coverage with a feeling she had trouble naming at first before she identified it. Not triumph, exactly, which she'd expected to feel, but something quieter and more solid. The satisfaction of a thing having been seen clearly, of the gap between what had actually happened and what the official record showed having been closed. Harrow's properties in the county were subject to federal receivership pending the resolution of the fraud charges. 3 families who had sold to him under duress were able to petition for review of their agreements. Tom Dunbar's sale was voided on the grounds of contract coercion. He was back on his land by late summer, thinner than before, but moving with the specific purpose of a man who has been given back something he'd believed was gone for good. Clara Monroe's contract was more complicated, as Beecham's contracts tended to be. But Adelia Marsh, who had by this point taken a general interest in the cleanup of Harrow's operation that exceeded her original commission, found 3 enforceable irregularities in it and got the original agreement set aside. The house Harrow had given her as part of the deal was transferred to her outright, free of Beecham's management and free of the restrictive clauses that had kept her from contesting anything. She came to Cora's property on a September afternoon to tell her. She stood in the kitchen and held her coffee cup with both hands, the way she had in her sitting room above the Taylors, and she said, "I own my house," with the specific weight of someone saying a sentence that contains 20 years of complicated history in 4 words. "Yes, you do," Cora said. "I haven't owned something outright since before my husband died," Clara said. She was quiet for a moment. "I thought I'd feel relieved. I mostly feel tired." "That's what relief feels like, I think," Cora said. "When it's the real kind." Clara looked at her. "You're not what I expected when the sheriff brought you to my door," she said. "I thought you'd be—" She paused, considering. "I thought you'd be harder." "I am hard," Cora said. "Not like that," Clara said. "I thought you'd be hard the way people get when they've been disappointed a lot. Closed in." She looked at her coffee. "You're not closed in." Cora thought about the blue dress hanging in the cedar chest in her bedroom, back where it lived between occasions. She thought about the note on the kitchen table that night, folded along its crease. She thought about the knock at the door. "I almost was," she said honestly. "I was getting there." In October, Elias proposed. He did it in the most characteristic possible way, which was to say, without ceremony, without staging, without anything that resembled the calculated performances that Cora had by now become an expert at identifying. They were in the north field at the end of the day, checking the fence Elias had repaired in spring, and the light was doing its amber thing above the ridge, and he said without any particular preamble, "I'd like to marry you." She stopped walking. "I'm not going to make a production of it," he said. "You know how I feel, and I know you know. And I think you feel the same way, and you know I know that. So this is just me saying the thing directly." He paused. "I'd like to marry you, if you'd like to marry me." She looked at him. He looked back at her with the exact same steadiness with which he'd looked at her from her porch the night of the dance. The look that had nothing performative in it, just the genuine, slightly uncomfortable weight of a man saying what he actually meant and waiting to see what happened. "I would like to marry you," she said. "All right," he said. "That's it?" she said. "What else?" he said. She thought about it. "Nothing," she said. "That's exactly right." He took her hand the same way he had on the porch that evening in the dark, briefly and without announcement. They stood in the north field in the amber light and looked at the fence that had been repaired and the fields that were hers and the line of the ridge against the sky, and it was not a perfect moment. Her boots were muddy, and she had a blister on her left palm from the morning's work, and he had a cut on his chin from shaving that hadn't quite healed. But it was entirely real, which was better than perfect and always had been. They married in November in the Millfield Courthouse, with Judge Abernathy presiding and Clara Monroe and Tom Dunbar as witnesses, and Margaret Finch weeping with the complete, uninhibited enthusiasm of someone who had decided this outcome warranted it. Ruth Hadley had organized a small gathering at the Founders Hall afterward, without being asked, which Cora could have found presumptuous, but instead found, in the event, simply kind. Elias wore his good jacket and his least-worn boots, and looked, Cora thought, like a man who was exactly where he had decided to be, which was the most settled and least complicated version of him she had yet seen. She wore the blue dress, not for anyone else, not as a statement, just because it was the right dress and it had been waiting long enough in the cedar chest and it deserved another occasion. Elias looked at it when she came out of the bedroom that morning, and something moved across his face that was too complicated and too private to name. "That's the dress from the night of the dance," he said. "It is," she said. He didn't say anything else about it, but he offered her his arm with a deliberateness that was its own kind of statement, and she took it. The railroad came through in the spring of the following year, 1885. The construction moved across the southern 8 acres of Cora's land over the course of 3 weeks, a coordinated, enormous operation of men and machinery and noise that transformed the character of the property temporarily into something barely recognizable. The earth turned up and the air full of dust and iron, and then resolved, as construction did, into the finished thing. 2 rails running clean and level through the southern section, a whistle stop a quarter-mile east of her fence line that the railroad called Whitmore Junction, because Stokes, who turned out to be a man with a reasonable sense of what was owed, had named it after the landowner who'd negotiated the most precisely worded easement his office had processed that year. Whitmore Junction. She stood at the south fence on the morning the first train came through and listened to it announce itself from 3 miles east, that particular low whistle that carried farther than anything else that sound could do, and watched it come. Elias was beside her. She hadn't asked him to be there. He had just come because he understood without being told that this was a moment that wanted a witness who mattered. The train passed at a speed that felt enormous compared to the stillness it moved through, and the sound of it was extraordinary and briefly total, and then it was past, and the sound diminished east and the dust settled back, and the south field was what it had always been, except that now there were 2 rails running through the lower section and a name on a sign a quarter-mile away that had her father's name in it. Edmund Whitmore broke that ground, she said. Not to Elias particularly, just to the fact of it. "I know," Elias said. "He'd think it was funny," she said, "that all this happened over his 20 acres. He was a modest man. He'd think the whole thing was disproportionate." "Modest men build the things that last," Elias said. "The immodest ones just try to own them." She looked at him. Sometimes he said something that landed like that, without trying to, without the self-consciousness of a man making an observation he wanted credit for. And it sat in her chest with the weight of something true. The general store that she'd worked in 3 mornings a week for 4 years came up for sale in the summer of 1885. Old Henderson, who'd run it since before Cora could remember, was 71, and his eyesight was failing, and his son had no interest in Millfield or dry goods. And Henderson came to Cora specifically, not to the town's businessmen, not to the land speculators who had started sniffing around Millfield again now that the railroad had changed the calculation, but to Cora, and offered her right of first purchase. She talked to Elias about it that evening. "Can you run a store and manage the property?" he asked. "I managed the property alone for 3 years while working 3 mornings a week at that store," she said. He accepted this with the unelaborated nod of a man who had asked a genuine question and received a sufficient answer. "Do you want to run it?" She thought about Henderson's store, the particular smell of it, the cedar and dry goods, and the specific mix of things a frontier town required. She thought about 4 years of knowing where everything was and what everyone needed, and the satisfaction, which she'd never articulated before but recognized clearly, of being the person who had what people came looking for. "Yes," she said, "I want to run it." "Then that's what we're doing," he said. She bought it in August. She renamed it Whitmore General, which felt either bold or straightforward depending on how you looked at it, and she had decided she was done worrying about which side of that line a thing fell on. She restocked it with more care than Henderson had managed in his last few years, added a corner with seed stock and farm supplies that the town had been driving 40 minutes south to get, and discovered, over the following months, that she was genuinely good at it in a way that went beyond knowing where things were. She was good at understanding what people needed before they knew how to ask for it, good at the specific human transaction of a general store, which was not merely commercial, but was also informational and social, and occasionally the kind of practical help that had nothing to do with dry goods. Ruth Hadley, who had been buying her household supplies from Henderson for 20 years, transferred her patronage to Whitmore General and began spending approximately twice as long in the store as any shopping trip actually required, which turned out to be a kind of blessing in disguise because Ruth's inability to stop talking meant that everyone in Millfield knew about the store within a week of its opening. Tom Dunbar brought his eggs to sell on consignment, which she accepted at a fair margin and which turned out to be some of the best eggs in the county, a fact she mentioned to every customer until it was established as common knowledge. Clara Monroe came in on Tuesdays, and Cora had taken to putting the good tea aside for her, and they would talk for 20 minutes while the morning was quiet. And Cora found in this a friendship that was specific and adult, in the way of friendships that form between people who have been through something together rather than simply grown up in proximity. Elias continued as sheriff. There had been a question, unasked but present between them in the first months after the Harrow situation resolved, about whether the scale of what Millfield offered him was still sufficient, whether a man who had built a federal case against a multi-county fraud operation could still find meaning in the ordinary work of a town sheriff, disputes between neighbors, drunk men on Saturday nights, the lost dog on the North Road, the accounting irregularity at the feed store. He could, it turned out. Not without occasional restlessness. She would see it in him sometimes, a kind of reaching quality in his attention when news came from outside the county, the world asserting its larger dimensions. But he was a man who had learned the difference between the scale of a thing and its significance, and the work of protecting a specific community of specific people had a significance that didn't require scale to justify it. He wrote to the federal marshal's office in Austin twice more over the following years, as his ongoing vigilance turned up situations that exceeded his county jurisdiction. Raymond Holt had become something like a colleague, and the correspondence between them was the kind of professional friendship that existed between people who respected each other's competence across a distance. Prentice, the marshal who'd come to Millfield, wrote once to say that the documentation Elias had provided in the Harrow case had been cited as exemplary practice in a training context, which Elias relayed to Cora with the specific, slightly embarrassed manner of a man who was pleased and didn't particularly want to show it. "Tell him it was collaborative," Cora said. "I already did," Elias said. They had children. Not immediately. They were both 30 years old when they married, and they approached the question of children the way they approached most things, practically and honestly. They talked about it, which was itself a thing Cora had not expected, having absorbed without quite realizing it the assumption that such things were decided for women rather than by them. Elias asked what she wanted, and she told him, and they agreed, and in 1886 their first child was born, a girl they named Frances after neither family specifically, but because they both heard the name and recognized it as right. Frances was born with her mother's dark eyes and her father's particular quality of attention, the alert, taking-in regard that in a baby looked like simple alertness, and in the child she became looked like someone who was perpetually building a picture of something. She watched things. She listened before she spoke. At 4 years old, she observed a dispute between two neighboring families over a fence line and explained, to her father's barely concealed delight, why both parties were partially correct and what the resolution should be. Elias had looked at Cora over Frances's head with the expression of a man encountering something he hadn't anticipated and was very glad about. Their second child, a boy they named Edmund, arrived in 1888. Edmund was the opposite of Frances in temperament, loud where she was quiet, immediate where she was deliberate, throwing himself at the world with a physical confidence that kept Cora perpetually monitoring the distance between him and whatever he'd decided to climb. He had his grandfather's stubbornness without yet having his grandfather's judgment to direct it, which meant the property saw a great deal of creative problem-solving in his wake, including one incident with the tack room that Cora and Elias did not discuss in specific detail with anyone. They were not easy children. They were not the kind of children who appear in idealized accounts of family life. They were specific, complicated, frequently inconvenient people who were learning how to be human in the ways that all people learned it, imperfectly, iteratively, with significant trial and error. Cora loved them with the same unperformative, clear-eyed quality that she brought to everything else in her life. Not consuming, not suffocating, but absolute. She was not a mother who dissolved into the role. She remained herself inside it. The woman who ran the store and managed the land and wrote careful letters to the railroad's regional office and sat on the Millfield Civic Improvement Committee that formed in 1887, which she'd been asked to join and had agreed to on the condition that it actually improved things rather than just meeting. The Civic Committee was Elias's idea, in the roundabout way that Elias's ideas tended to arrive, not as suggestions, but as observations. He had said one evening that Millfield was growing faster than its institutions were, and that someone with organizational sense and community trust would need to be part of shaping what it grew into. He had been looking at the wall when he said it, not at her, which she had learned was his way of saying something he thought she should hear without it feeling like a directive. She had looked at the wall alongside him for a moment and then said, "Is that your way of saying you think I should be on the civic committee?" "I'm saying the committee needs people with organizational sense and community trust," he said. "You can draw your own conclusions." She drew her conclusions. She joined the committee. The years had a shape that she didn't fully see from inside them, only later, looking back from a distance that only time provided. From inside, they were simply days. Some good, some difficult, some entirely ordinary in the way that most of life was ordinary. The vast middle ground of existence that didn't qualify as crisis or triumph, but was simply the continuous work of building something and maintaining what you'd built. The general store expanded in 1889, a new storage room on the north side that doubled the seed and farm supply section. Frances started school the same year, which she approached with the focused intensity of someone who had been waiting for a specific resource to become available. The South Field, the section the railroad ran through, was leased to Tom Dunbar's son, who had taken over from his father and proved to have a better head for it than his father had suggested he would. Cora received the lease income and put it back into the property, repairing the barn and replacing the fence line on the eastern border that Harrow's men had surveyed from horseback in 1883. She had never forgotten those boot tracks in the soft earth that Elias had shown her with a lantern, the stopping point at her eastern fence where men had stood and measured. She had replaced that fence section with new posts and better wire in the summer of 1890, and she had done it herself, mostly, with Elias helping on the heaviest posts. And when it was done, she stood at the eastern boundary of her 20 acres and looked east toward where Harrow's property had been, now in federal receivership, now being administered by a regional court, the mahogany desk and the maps with red ink presumably dispersed to wherever the possessions of men who overreached tended to end up. And she felt something that wasn't triumph and wasn't relief. Something quieter than both of those. Completion, maybe. The recognition of a thing having run its full course. She told Elias about the feeling that evening, sitting on the porch the way they did in the evenings when the children were in bed and the day had put itself away. She described it as best she could, the not triumph, the not relief, the something quieter than both. He listened, then was quiet for a moment. "My father used to say that the opposite of anger wasn't peace," he said. "It was just having put the thing down." She turned to look at him. "Your father said that?" "He was a carpenter," Elias said. "He had a way of putting things that was very literal and somehow always right." He paused. "I didn't talk about him much." "No," she said. "You didn't." "He died when I was 19, Elias said. "Before San Angelo. Before any of it." He was looking at the darkening ridge, the way he looked at things when he was sorting through them. "I think he would have liked this," he said. "This specific life. The work of it." Then she thought about Edmund Whitmore, who had broken this ground, and Elias's carpenter father, whose name she now knew was James, and the way lives accumulated backward into people you never met, but were built from anyway. Frances with her father's attention, little Edmund with his grandfather's stubbornness, the way things passed forward whether you intended them to or not. "Tell me more about him," she said. "James?" And Elias did, which was something he hadn't done before in 7 years of knowing her. Not because he'd been hiding it, but because he was a man who'd spent a long time keeping the interior spaces of himself at a certain distance from other people. And the distance had been closing, slowly and without announcement, the way things actually changed over time as opposed to the dramatic transformation that stories sometimes suggested. He talked about his father for an hour, and she listened, and the evening settled fully into night around them. That was 1890. In 1895, the year Francis turned 9 and Edmund turned 7, and the second Millfield Railroad stop opened on the North Road because the town had grown enough to warrant it, Cora stood in the general store on an ordinary Wednesday morning and watched the street through the front window and was struck by the specific thought that she could not have imagined this from where she had been 12 years ago. Not the store, not the railroad, not the children, not Elias stopping by at noon to check that she'd eaten something, which he often forgot to do on busy mornings, and which he'd taken to managing with the quiet consistency of a man who had decided that this was one of the things he was going to make sure of. She could not have imagined any of the specific texture of this life from the position of the woman who had stood alone at a window on a spring evening in 1883, watching lantern light spill gold from the Founders Hall, waiting for a man who was never going to come. That woman had believed, in the part of herself she hadn't let speak loudly, that wanting things led to the shame of not getting them, and that the safe option was to want small and hold it close. She had been in the process of shrinking the perimeter of her own life down to a size that disappointment couldn't reach. The knock at the door had interrupted that process. She thought about that sometimes, the narrow, specific contingency of it. If Elias had not seen Tommy Briggs running to her house, if he had been on the other side of town that evening, if she had not opened the door, or had opened it and sent him away, which she could have done, which would have been the safer and more self-protective response. She thought about what her father had told her once, when she was 12 years old and afraid of something she couldn't quite name. He had been mending a section of fence, the same fence she'd been mending the rest of her life, and he'd said without looking up from the wire, "Cora, the only thing more expensive than a risk is the one you didn't take when you should have." She hadn't understood it fully at 12. She understood it now. Elias came by at noon. He came through the door with the particular look of a man who had been moderately busy all morning and was glad of the interruption, and he came around the counter, not proprietary, not performative, just familiar with the geography of a space that was hers, and looked at the cold coffee on the shelf beside the till and gave her the look. "I was going to drink it," she said. "When?" he said. "Eventually," she said. He set it in front of her. She drank it, which was cold and not particularly pleasant. And the ordinariness of it, the cold coffee, the noon light through the store windows, his coat and badge, and the small cut on his hand from whatever he'd been working on this morning, was more than she'd thought she was going to have once. More than she'd let herself want. "Francis wants a horse," he said. "Francis wants a horse, a telescope, and a complete set of law books," Cora said. "She's 9. "The horse is the most reasonable request," he said. "The horse is also the most expensive and most work," she said. "She'd do the work," he said. And this was true, and they both knew it, Francis being a child who had inherited both parents' particular version of follow-through, which was to say she didn't start things she wasn't going to finish. "Let me think about it," Cora said. "That means yes," he said. "That means let me think about it," she said. He smiled. Not the almost smile or the suggested smile, just the real one. The one she'd seen occasionally since the night of the dance and had never entirely gotten used to in the way that you never entirely got used to something that was genuinely good. She thought about the blue dress upstairs in the cedar chest, where it lived now between its occasions, which had grown in number over the years. She thought about the note she'd folded along its crease and put in the locked box, which was still in the bottom drawer of the bedroom dresser, because she had never been able to bring herself to throw it away. Not from bitterness, but from the same principle as the paperwork. It said what it said, and what it said was the beginning of everything that had come after. A pressing business matter that cannot be delayed. The matter, she thought, had turned out to be hers after all. The afternoon came in through the store windows and lay warm and specific across the floorboards, and out on the street Millfield went about its business, and in the south field the railroad moved east at whatever speed. Railroads moved through the parts of the country that people had once thought were too far from anywhere to matter, And Frances Vance, 9 years old, was in her classroom 4 streets over building the argument she was going to make that evening about the horse, and Edmund Vance, 7 years old, was probably climbing something he shouldn't be climbing. And Tom Dunbar's son was checking the fence on the eastern border of land his father had lost and been given back. And Clara Monroe owned her house outright and had started teaching reading to the children of the families that came in with the railroad workers and had found in it a purpose she hadn't known she was looking for. Not everything had been made right. Tom Dunbar had lost 3 years of his land. Clara had signed a contract in a moment of exhaustion that no amount of legal remedy could return to her as 3 unspoiled years. Billy Carver, 31 years old, was still dead. The righting of a wrong did not unmake the wrong, and anyone who told you otherwise was selling something easier than the truth. But the ground under Cora's feet was the ground her father had broken, and it was still hers, and the man behind the counter was the one who had knocked on her door on the worst evening of a year that had also contained the best evening of her life. And the children who would come through that door at 4 o'clock and demand to be fed were the specific, complicated, entirely real people she was building a life alongside. What she had learned across 12 years of managing, fighting, losing small things and holding the large ones was that a life didn't become good by becoming easy. It became good by becoming true. By closing the gap, day by day and decision by decision, between what you were willing to settle for and what you actually believed you were worth. She had been worth the fight. She had just needed one night in 1883 for someone to knock on the door and give her the chance to figure that out. She picked up her cold coffee and finished it. It was terrible. She was grateful for every bit of it.